By the time I sat in that room, the last of the autumn light going thin through the windows, I had already spent 24 years married to a man named Neshoba Blackbird, and none of those years had prepared me for the 5 words that were about to drain the color out of his eldest son's face in front of a room full of strangers. The young lawyer read them off the final page of the settlement, slow the way men read when they are still trying to sound older than they are. I'm glad to have you here. 5 words, nothing more. But I had waited weeks to write them into that page, and I had waited even longer than that, most of a season longer, to understand why my husband would leave me a war disguised as a surrender. I remember that moment more clearly than I remember his funeral, which is a strange thing to admit out loud, but grief does that to time. It flattens some days into nothing at all, and it carves others into stones so deep you could run your thumb along the edges of them 40 years from now and still feel exactly where the blade went in. That was one of the carved ones. Chaska sitting too straight in his chair, the way he always sat, like a man who had rehearsed being important since he was a boy in short pants. Keel beside him, hands folded on the table, playing at humility, the way some men play at prayer, all posture, and no belief underneath it. I expect I will remember all of it on the day I die, but none of that will make sense unless I go back further, so I will. My name is Winona Blackbird. I am 67 years old, and I have spent most of my life on land that was never mine until a man decided it should be. I was married once before Neshoba, briefly badly, to a man who left before either of us had the decency to call it a mistake out loud. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it matters later the shape of what I already knew about disappointment, before I ever met him, the way it made me slower to trust and faster to notice when something in a room didn't sit right. I met him at a livestock auction of all places, both of us standing at the same rail, watching a bay gelding nobody else in the yard seemed to want, though I could see even then what he was seeing, the good bones under the poor coat, the animal simply needing someone patient enough to bring it back around. Neshoba bid on that horse like a man who had already decided the outcome before the auctioneer opened his mouth, and when he won it, he turned to me, a stranger he had never once spoken to, and said the horse would do better with 2 people looking after it than one. It was a foolish, transparent line, and I knew it was a line even as he said it, and I liked him anyway, more than I had liked anyone in longer than I wanted to admit out loud to myself that afternoon. We were slow about it after that, both of us too old and too scarred to rush toward anything meeting for coffee, some Sundays walking that same gelding out along fence lines while we talked around the edges of our own histories without quite handing them over whole. It took him 4 months to tell me about his first wife, gone 11 years by then. And it took me nearly as long to tell him about the marriage I'd walked away from years earlier, the 2 of us trading our damage back and forth carefully, like people handing over something breakable, and waiting to see if the other person's hands were steady enough to hold it. By the time he finally asked me to marry him out on that same fence line with the gelding cropping grass between us, I already knew every hard thing about him worth knowing, and he already knew every hard thing about me, and neither of us pretended otherwise, standing there in the wind. I was 43 when I met Neshoba Blackbird. He was 50, a widower himself, raising 2 grown sons who had already learned to run a household without a mother in it and had gotten a little too comfortable with the shape of that absence. Chaska was finishing law school in those first years, sharp and ambitious, in the particular way of young men who have decided early that softness is a weakness they intend to outgrow. Kale was a few years behind him, restless, always hunting for the shortcut instead of the road, the kind of young man who believed the world owed him an explanation for every closed door. Their mother had died of a fever, nobody caught in time, when Chaska was 12 and Kaylee was 9, and Neshoba told me once early in our courtship that he'd watched both boys handle that loss in almost opposite directions. Chaska turning quiet and controlled, determined never again to be caught unprepared by anything life threw at him. Keel turning loud and restless, determined never again to sit still long enough for grief to catch up with him. I understood hearing that why both of them had built the particular armor they wore by the time I met them. I understood it far better, in fact, than either of them ever seemed to understand it in themselves. I never tried to replace their mother. I want that understood clearly, because it matters for everything that comes after. I never once called myself their mother, not to their faces, not even alone in my own head at 3 in the morning when the loneliness of being a second wife pressed in hardest. I called myself what I actually was, their father's wife. And for 24 years I told myself that was enough, that love didn't need a blood claim to be real, that showing up counted for something even when nobody handed you a certificate proving it. Ash Ridge was his before it was ours. 300 acres of high grass and cottonwood running along the riverland that had passed down through his family longer than either of us could properly trace on paper, though the elders in his community could trace it well enough in stories and the names of bends in the river, in the places where his grandfather had once grazed horses before there was a fence line anywhere on the property. The land smelled like wood smoke and cut hay, even in winter when there was no fire burning and no hay being cut because the smell had simply soaked into the soil after 100 years of both. In summer, the whole valley turned the particular gold that only high grass country turns heat shimmering low over the pasture in the late afternoons, the river running slower and lower until the first real rains of autumn brought it back up over its banks. I came to love that land the way you love a person gradually, and then all at once, until I could no longer separate my own sense of home from the specific angle the light fell across that eastern ridge every evening just before dusk. I had grown up on land that belonged to other people, my whole life before Ash Ridge, my own family renting the same small parcel outside town for 3 generations without ever once holding the deed to it ourselves. And there is a particular ache that comes from finally standing on ground that answers to your own name, after a lifetime of never quite having that. I never said as much to Neshoba directly, not in so many words, but I think he understood it anyway, the way he insisted my name go on every document alongside his own from the very first year, no matter how many times the county clerk's office seemed mildly confused by a wife's name appearing where custom usually left a blank. The tribal council took longer to accept me than Neshoba did, which surprised neither of us. I was an outsider marrying into land and history that had survived a great deal longer than my own family's presence in that valley, and I understood even then that trust in a community like that had to be earned slowly through years of showing up, rather than through any single grand gesture. I went to the council meetings when Neshoba invited me, sat quietly in the back for the first several years, learned to listen far more than I spoke. It was Neshoba's aunt, the one who'd spoken so long and cried so hard at his funeral, who finally welcomed me properly, gifting me a beaded bracelet at our 5th anniversary that I still wear most days, telling me plainly that she'd watched me long enough to know I wasn't simply passing through. I have never once taken that bracelet off since, not even during the hardest weeks after Neshoba died, when I could barely bring myself to get dressed at all some mornings. We built the leather and woodworking shop together in the first 5 years of our marriage, turning an old equipment barn into something that made real money saddles and cabinetry good enough that people drove 3 states over just to put their names on a waiting list. I learned to cut leather at 44 years old, my hands clumsy and slow at first, blistered for months, because Neshoba believed a woman could learn anything she set her mind to and refused to let me quit on a bad week. We built the lodge on the lake with our own hands, one long summer hauling lumber ourselves because we couldn't afford a crew yet and didn't want to wait for one. I remember him standing on the unfinished porch of that lodge, sawdust caught in his hair, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, telling me this was the first thing in his whole life that nobody could ever take credit for, but us. Just us. I believed him completely. I still do even now, even after everything that came after taught me how carefully a man can love someone and still keep secrets from her at the exact same time. The first Sunday dinner I ever cooked for the two of them, before Neshoba and I were even engaged, Chaska showed up 20 minutes late in a suit he clearly wore to make some kind of point and spent the whole meal asking me polite, precise questions that felt less like conversation and more like a deposition. Where had I grown up? What had my first marriage been like? Whether I intended to keep working after the wedding phrased in a way that made it sound like a genuine curiosity rather than the quiet audit it actually was. Cale was 17 that year, all elbows and borrowed cologne, and he spent most of the dinner watching his brother's questions land before deciding whether to laugh at them the way younger brothers often learn to gauge a room by someone else's reaction first. I remember driving home that night thinking I had passed some kind of test, only to understand years later that with Chaska there was never a single test to pass. There was only ever the next one, quietly rescheduled the moment you thought you'd cleared it. Neshoba apologized for his sons that first night, once we were alone in the careful way men of his generation apologized for things they didn't quite believe needed apologizing for. "Give them time," he said. "They lost their mother young, and time is the only medicine either of them has ever really trusted." I believed him. I wanted to believe him the way you want to believe any explanation that lets you keep loving someone without having to also be afraid of what he's raised. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being a second wife to grown sons, one I don't think anyone warns you about beforehand. You are expected to love people who did not choose you, who were perfectly whole in their grief and their routines before you arrived, who will forever measure you consciously or not against a woman you will never meet and can never compete with because she is frozen forever in memory at her best moments. We married in October on the same stretch of pasture where he'd once told me nobody would ever take credit for what we built. But us before either lodge or workshop existed back when the whole plan for both was still just two people talking late into the night about a future neither of us fully trusted yet to actually arrive. Chenoa stood up for me. Chaska, 26 that year, and already carrying himself like a man twice his age, gave a short, careful toast that managed to mention his father 17 times, and me exactly twice both times by my full name, rather than anything warmer. Kaylee cried at the ceremony itself, the only unguarded thing I ever saw out of him in all the years that followed, and for a long time afterward, I let myself believe that tear had meant something closer to welcome than it apparently ever actually did. I tried for years. I went to their graduation, sat quietly in the third row, so their mother's side of the family could have the good seats. I sent birthday cards addressed simply from Dad and Winona, careful never to overstep into the word Mom, though some small foolish part of me always hoped one of them would offer it to me, first unprompted the way you hope for a gift you'd never ask for outright. I learned to make the particular corn stew Chaska's mother used to make from a recipe card. Neshoba found tucked in an old box, teaching myself the exact proportions over a dozen ruined attempts, hoping the taste of it might open some door that words never quite managed to. He ate it politely once the Thanksgiving I finally got it right and told me it was good, and never once asked for it again. And I understood watching his face that evening that some doors simply aren't meant to open no matter how patiently you knock. Neither of them ever did. Chaska was polite about the distance, the careful lawyerly kind of polite that keeps every door technically open while making sure you never actually walk through it. Cale was worse in some ways because he performed warmth so convincingly that I spent years believing it coming to family dinners with an easy laugh and a compliment about my cooking, and it took me embarrassingly long to notice that the warmth only ever arrived attached to something he wanted. I tell you this now, all of it, because I want you to understand that what came later did not begin with the folder they brought to Ash Ridge 3 weeks after we buried him. It began decades earlier in small increments in the space between how a family is supposed to feel and how ours actually did in every dinner where the temperature dropped a few careful degrees the moment I walked into a room the two of them had been sharing alone. Neshoba got sick the winter I turned 66. It started as something small the way these things always do when you look back on them later and wish you had known to be afraid sooner. A stubborn cough he blamed on the cold fatigue he waved off as simply getting older. By spring, the doctors were using words that made the exam room feel smaller every single time they said them. Words like staging and treatment windows and quality of life phrases designed, I think, to soften something that cannot actually be softened, no matter how gently you phrase it. Chaska flew in once during that first round of treatment, ostensibly to help, though what he mostly did was stand in the hallway outside the oncologist's office, arguing on the phone with someone about billing codes, while his father sat inside answering questions alone. When I finally asked him to step into the room with us, he did, but he spent the appointment asking the doctor pointed questions about prognosis timelines rather than treatment options, questions that had less to do with Neshoba's comfort and more to do with some private calendar he seemed to be keeping in his head. I said something to him about it afterward in the parking garage, my voice sharper than I usually let it get with either of his sons. He told me he was simply being practical, that somebody needed to think about logistics while I was busy being emotional. I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count in the years since, wondering how a man could stand 3 feet from his own father's diagnosis and call the person holding that man's hand the emotional one. Neshoba heard about that exchange later from me reluctantly, because I hadn't wanted to burden him with more than the disease itself was already asking him to carry. He was quiet for a long moment after I told him, and then he said something I didn't fully understand until much later. He told me that Chaska had learned to survive his own mother's death by turning grief into logistics, and that he worried watching his son in that hallway that the boy had never actually learned any other way to love someone through dying. It didn't excuse the cruelty of the comment, but it gave me even then some small window into the machinery that had built it. There is one night from those months I will let myself describe only one, because it explains something about the two of us that nothing else quite does. It was late spring past midnight, and he had woken confused, frightened in a way I had never once seen him. Frightened in 23 years of marriage, asking me in a voice gone thin and young where the horses were, whether someone had thought to bring them in before the weather turned. There were no horses left by then, not really, only the 2 aging mares we kept more out of sentiment than used safely in the barn the whole time. But I told him yes, I had already brought them in. I had checked the gate twice myself, and I watched his whole body ease at the lie. His breathing slow back down to something almost normal, his hand finding mine in the dark, without needing to see it first. I have thought about that night more than almost any other since he died. How much of loving someone at the end comes down to knowing exactly which true things to set aside for a while, and exactly which small mercies to hand over instead. I never once told anyone about that particular night, not even Chenoa, because some moments belong only to the 2 people who lived them, and I have come to believe that keeping a few of those moments private is its own small act of loyalty, one that has nothing to do with secrecy and everything to do with tenderness. I won't walk you through the rest of those months, in the kind of detail that belongs only to the person who actually lived them. I will tell you that I drove him to appointments 2 hours each way more times than I could count, that I learned to read blood counts the way some women read scripture, searching each new number for a mercy that didn't always show up. I sat in waiting rooms so many times that the receptionist stopped asking for my name and started simply waving me back when they saw my car pull into the lot. I held a cold washcloth to his forehead at 4 in the morning more nights than I can count, and I never once, not for a single hour of it, considered being anywhere else. Chaska called sometimes from his office in San Francisco, brief calls that rarely outlasted the length of a commercial break, always ending with some version of "let me know if anything changes," as though Neshoba's dying was a weather pattern he intended to monitor from a safe distance. Keeley called even less, though he texted more, which is its own particular kind of nothing words on a screen, standing in for a hand that never once reached across a hospital bed to hold his father's. Neither of them came to see him properly until the very end, and when they finally came, they came together, and they came dressed like men attending a business meeting rather than a deathbed, dark suits pressed and unfamiliar, the kind of clothes that belonged in a courtroom rather than a hospice room with the blinds half drawn against the afternoon sun. In the final week, the hospice nurse told me it wouldn't be long now, the particular phrase they all seemed trained to use gentle and vague enough to prepare a person without quite naming the thing itself. Neshoba was mostly sleeping by then, surfacing every few hours to squeeze my hand or say something half-formed about the ranch, about whether the fences on the north pasture had been checked before winter. I told him yes every time, whether or not it was true, because by then I had learned that comfort mattered more than precision, and because some part of me suspected he already knew the difference, and was simply grateful I cared enough to lie. Neshoba died on a Tuesday in early autumn. I was holding his hand. I want that on the record because in the weeks that followed there were people, family among them, who tried to suggest I had somehow been absent during his final years, that I had let something slip through my fingers out of carelessness or convenience. I was not absent. I was there for every hour that mattered, and I have never once regretted a single one of those hours, not even the hardest ones, not even the ones that still find me at 3 in the morning when the house is too quiet, and the space beside me in the bed feels wider than any king mattress has any right to feel. The funeral was small the way he wanted it. He'd told me himself more than once during those final months, exactly how he wanted things handled. No long procession, no elaborate service. Just the small chapel cemetery near the north pasture where his own parents were buried close enough to Ash Ridge that he used to say he'd still be able to hear the cattle from wherever he ended up. I arranged every detail myself in the days after he died, working through a grief so thick. Some mornings I could barely remember driving to the funeral home, though I remember with total clarity choosing the plot beside his parents, the one with a clear line of sight toward the river he'd loved his whole life. Ash Ridge people came ranch hands who had worked the land under him for 20 years. An old friend from the tribal council who spoke far longer than anyone expected and cried harder than anyone else in the room. An unashamed, racking grief that made the rest of us feel briefly gratefully permitted to fall apart in public too. 2 of the younger hands boys, really barely into their 20s, stood at the very back with their hats pressed against their chests, the entire service. And I remembered then how patiently Neshoba had taught each of them to read weather and cattle, both how he used to say a good rancher was really just a good listener who happened to work outdoors. Watching them that morning, red-eyed and silent, I understood that his teaching had taken root in more places than just our own marriage. My oldest friend, Chenoa Yellowhorse, stood beside me the entire service, with her hand tucked firmly under my elbow, the way she'd stood beside me at my first wedding 30 years earlier, and every hard thing in between, not saying much, just being a wall I could lean against when my knees threatened to give out over the grave. Women from the ranch families brought casseroles for a week straight afterward, more food than any single person could eat alone. The way grief always seems to translate itself into food out here, as though enough warm dishes stacked in a refrigerator might somehow fill the particular emptiness they were meant to answer for. A few of the older women pressed my hands between both of theirs and told me in low voices, meant only for me, that they had seen how I cared for him those final months, that whatever else happened now, that part of the record stood clear and would not be argued away by anyone. Chaska and Keeley stood at the front in those same dark suits, looking expensive and unfamiliar like costumes borrowed for the occasion and not quite broken in yet. They called me Mother that day. Both of them more than once in voices pitched just a shade too loud, just enough to be overheard by the small crowd gathered under the cottonwoods. I remember thinking even through the fog of my own grief that it sounded rehearsed, that there was something performed in the timing of it, the way an actor hits a line a beat too crisply because he has run it in front of a mirror one too many times. Chenoa noticed it too. She squeezed my arm at the exact moment I noticed it myself, which told me I hadn't imagined the wrongness of it. It should have told me something more. It did tell me something, if I am honest. I simply was not ready yet to hear it fully, not with my husband's casket still visible at the edge of my sightline, not with the smell of turned earth still hanging in the cold morning air. Sahel found me near the reception line afterward, still in his good funeral suit, his handshake lingering the beat longer than the moment strictly called for. He told me to call him the following week before either of the boys did, in a voice pitched low enough that only I could hear it. I asked him why the urgency, and he only said that estates had a way of bringing out the worst timing in people, and that he'd rather I hear from him first than be caught flat-footed by whatever came next. I thanked him and let the moment pass, too tired that day to hear the warning folded inside his kindness. I have wondered since whether he already suspected even then, standing in that receiving line, exactly which direction this particular family was about to tilt. 3 weeks after we buried him, the two of them came out to Ash Ridge to talk business. I was sitting in Neshoba's old office when they arrived in his leather chair, the one that still held the shape of him, even now the leather gone soft and dark in the places where his hands used to rest on the arms at the base near his right hip where he always leaned when he was thinking hardest. I hadn't moved anything in that room. I couldn't. The bookshelf still held his ledgers in the exact order he'd left them, oldest at the bottom, the newest still open on the desk to a page he'd never finished. A coffee mug sat on the corner of the desk, rinsed but never put away, because putting it away felt too much like admitting he wasn't simply out at the barn and due back any minute. The window still looked out over the garden we'd planted together the summer we finally got the lodge roof, watertight tomatoes gone leggy and unpicked now because I hadn't had the heart to go near them since. There was a photograph on the desk, not of his sons, but of the two of us on our wedding day, both of us laughing at some joke. Neither of us could remember anymore because the joke had died with him too quietly, the way small private things do. Chaska knocked once and walked in without waiting for an answer, the way he always did in that house, some old habit of ownership he'd never quite unlearned even after 24 years of it belonging to someone else's marriage. Keel followed a step behind him, the way he always followed a step behind a man who had never once in his life had an original idea and had made a quiet, comfortable peace with that a long time ago. "We need to talk about the estate," Chaska said. "No greeting, no sitting down slowly the way people do when they still respect the room they're standing in. Just that flat and immediate the estate, as though grief had a clock on it and the clock had already run out." I asked him what kind of talk he meant, though something cold had already begun moving low through my stomach before he answered some old animal instinct, recognizing the shape of bad news before it had found its words. He set a folder on the desk, thick, official-looking, the kind of folder built to intimidate before anyone even opens it. He opened it slowly anyway, like a man savoring a moment he had been looking forward to for longer than he would ever admit. "Ash Ridge," he said. "900,000 at current appraisal. Goes to Keel and myself jointly. The Lake Lodge 620. The workshop and its accounts 350. All to us." Each number landed like something physical, a small blow to a different part of my body. Our home. The lodge we had built with our own blistered hands one impossibly long summer. The workshop where I had learned to cut leather at 44 years old because my husband believed I could learn anything, all of it folded now into 2 flat sentences delivered in a tone better suited to reading a grocery list aloud. "And me?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected it to. I don't know where that steadiness came from. Maybe it had been quietly building in me for years without my permission, waiting for exactly this moment to finally show itself. Keel shifted in his chair. The particular fidget of a man about to say something he already knows sounds worse out loud than it did in his head. Well, he said, there's the insurance. $150,000. That should be more than enough to get you settled somewhere comfortable. $150,000 for 24 years. For every hospital hallway, every sleepless night, every meal I had cooked in a kitchen that would apparently now belong to strangers. I hadn't even met yet in a life I had built with my own 2 hands right alongside the man they were dividing up like inventory. I see, I said, though I did not see. Not even close. It's not personal, Keeley added, and something about the practiced softness in his voice made my skin want to crawl straight off my own body. Dad always wanted the land to stay in the family line. You understand? Family line. As if 24 years of loving his father, 24 years of actually showing up counted for less in the end than blood I had never been born with. As if love were some lesser currency always due to be devalued the moment the man who gave it to me was no longer alive to defend its worth. Of course, Chaska said, closing the folder with a small, satisfied click. You can stay in the house for 30 days, while you arrange things. 30 days, to dismantle a life that had taken 24 years to build, board by board, season by season, the way you build anything worth having. And there was one more thing, Chaska said. And there is always one more thing with men like him, a final small cruelty saved for last because he understood on some level exactly how much heavier it would land after everything else had already been said. He pulled a second thinner document from the folder, and something in the careful way he handled it told me before he even spoke that this was the part he had been saving for the end. Medical expenses, he said, from the final months. Insurance covered most of it, but there's still $165,000 outstanding. Since you were the one making treatment decisions, the hospital is looking to you for the remainder. The room tilted just slightly the way a boat tilts under you before you fully registered the wave. $165,000 in debt weighed against $150,000 in insurance, which left almost nothing, which left less than nothing if I let myself finish the arithmetic honestly, and I did finish it right there, sitting in front of them, my mind moving faster than I wanted it to, faster than I could stop it from moving. I need time, I said finally. Time to think. Of course, Chaska said, standing, straightening his jacket with the small, satisfied motion of a man who believes the hard part of his day is already behind him. Take all the time you need. Though I'd move quickly on the medical bills. Interest doesn't wait for grief. They left, just like that. No embrace, no word of comfort, only the sound of the front door, and then a moment later, their 2 cars idling side by side in the driveway, engines running, both men leaning against their frames, talking low with their heads tilted close together in a way that excluded the entire rest of the world. I watched them through the office window. They were not comforting one another. They were celebrating. I recognized the posture because I had seen it before at closings on good land deals, at the openings of new business ventures that particular loose-shouldered easemen carry when they believe down in their bones that they have already won. I sat back down in Nashoba's chair. The leather sighed under me the way it always did, familiar patient entirely unbothered by any of this. I ran my hand along the worn arm of it, and for a long while I didn't think anything at all. I simply existed inside the wreckage of the last hour, letting the silence of the house close slowly over me like water rising past my knees, my waist, my chest. It was the silence that eventually moved me. Because grief has a sound, or at least it did in that house, a kind of humming absence that used to be filled by another person's footsteps overhead, another person's breathing in the next room. And that particular afternoon, the silence had a different quality to it entirely. Sharper. Waiting. As though it wanted me to do something instead of simply mourning alongside me the way it had for 3 straight weeks. I opened the small drawer in his desk, the one he kept his personal things and old receipts, business cards gone soft at the corners, a pocket knife he never used but never once thought to throw away either. My fingers moved past all of it out of pure habit until they touched something I did not recognize. Cold, small, metal, a key. Brass worn soft at the edges from years of handling the kind of key that belongs to something old, something with real weight behind it. Not a house key, not anything I had ever seen fit a single lock anywhere on this property in 24 years of living on it. I held it up to the window light and turned it slowly in my fingers, and it did not look like an accident. It looked like something a careful man had placed exactly where he wanted it found, and only by the one person he trusted enough to go looking. "Why would you keep this from me?" I said out loud to an empty room to a man who could no longer answer. I don't know how long I sat there turning that key over in my palm. long enough that the light through the window shifted from afternoon gold to the flatter gray of early evening. Long enough that when I finally looked up, Kaylee's car was gone from the driveway, but Chaska's was still there, parked at an angle near the gate engine off now, and Chaska himself standing beside it with his phone pressed hard to his ear. He wasn't smiling anymore. I watched him through the glass, and even from that distance, I could see it in the set of his shoulders, some tightness that had not been there an hour earlier when he was folding papers shut with that satisfied little click. He was pacing now, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. The phone gripped hard enough that I could see the tension traveling all the way up through his forearm. A man who has just inherited $900,000 in prime riverland does not pace a driveway like that. He does not grip a phone like it is the only thing left keeping him upright. Something was wrong on his end of whatever call that was. Something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with fear. I should have felt satisfaction watching that. Some small mean corner of me did, if I'm being fully honest. But mostly what settled into me was a cold, clean curiosity sliding into the exact place where my shock had been sitting frozen for 3 straight weeks. Because if Chaska was afraid, then Chaska knew something I didn't. And if there was one single thing 24 years with Neshoba Blackbird had taught me, it was that the man never left anything to chance. Not in the workshop, not in the ledgers, not in the way he built that lodge board by board so it would still be standing decades after both of us were gone. He had left me a key, which meant somewhere on this land he had left me a door. I closed my hand around the brass until the worn edge of it pressed into my palm, and I sat in his chair until the last of the daylight went out of the room, completely watching my stepson pace in the driveway, like a man who had just discovered the ground under his feet was not the ground he'd been promised. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow I would find out what that key opened. Tonight I would let them believe they had already won. Morning came the way it always did after a night of not really sleeping gray and reluctant sliding in through curtains I hadn't bothered to close. I lay in the bed we had shared for 24 years and stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the pacing man in the driveway, until my own thoughts started to feel like a room I could not find my way back out of. Chenoa called before 7, the way she always did on hard mornings. Some instinct she'd developed over 30 years of friendship that told her exactly when I needed a voice on the other end of the line more than I needed silence to think. She didn't ask how I was doing. She never did, not directly, because she'd learned decades ago that the question only ever made me perform an answer instead of giving her a true one. She asked instead what I was going to do about those boys in the particular flat tone she reserved for people who had disappointed her, and when I told her I was going to sign whatever they put in front of me, she went quiet on the line for so long I thought the call had dropped. "You are not that woman," she said finally. "I have known you since we were girls, chasing horses through the Meskwaki fairgrounds, and you are not a woman who folds. Whatever you're doing, Winona, you'd better be doing it on purpose." I didn't tell her about the key yet. I wasn't ready to say it out loud to anyone, not even her, not until I understood what it opened. But I let her words sit with me the whole drive into town, turning them over the way I'd been turning the key itself. And by the time I pulled into the gravel lot outside Sahaley's office, something in me had steadied. The drive itself took longer than it needed to that morning, or maybe it only felt that way every familiar landmark along the county road, suddenly asking something of me. It never used to ask the old grain silo, the church where half the valley had once gathered for our wedding, the turnoff toward the cemetery. I still hadn't found the nerve to visit. I kept both hands tight on the wheel the whole way, the key riding heavy in my coat pocket like a second heartbeat. The drive into town took me past the turnoff for the old grain elevator, long since shuttered, and past the little chapel where we'd buried him only weeks before, and I found myself slowing the truck without quite deciding to looking at the gate of that small cemetery the way you look at a door you aren't ready to walk back through yet. I didn't stop. I told myself there would be time for that kind of grief later, once the more urgent business of surviving the next 30 days had been settled one way or another. Sahaley Redwing had been Neshoba's lawyer for almost as long as I had been his wife. Not just his lawyer. His friend, the kind of friend who showed up at the hospital during those last months, without being asked who sat with me in the waiting room once for 2 hours without saying much of anything at all, just being a body in the chair beside mine. So the silence had somewhere to go besides straight through me. I trusted him. I still do in the ways that matter, even though what happened later complicated that trust in ways I never once saw coming. He'd handled Neshoba's father's estate before he ever handled Neshoba's own affairs. A fact I only learned that particular morning sitting across from him while he searched for the right words to talk me out of my own decision. 2 generations of Blackbird land had passed through his hands and his advice, And I think that history was exactly why he couldn't quite understand sitting there. Why I would walk away from a fight he'd spent 30 years believing was always worth having. His office sat on the second floor above the old feed store, a room that smelled like paper and strong coffee, and 40 years of other people's worst days, layered one on top of another until the smell itself had become a kind of furniture. He took his glasses off the moment I sat down. He always did that when he was about to say something he didn't want to say. Winona, he said, you cannot let them walk away with everything. Not like this. Not without a fight. I told him about the folder. I told him the numbers. Ash Ridge at 900,000, the lodge, the workshop, all of it sliding quietly into 2 names that weren't mine. I told him about the insurance, 150,000, and the medical debt eating almost every dollar of it before I'd even had the chance to hold the money in my own hands. He listened with his jaw tightening a little more with every sentence, and by the time I finished, he had already reached for a legal pad, the old kind, with the yellow paper, the kind he'd used since before I ever knew him. There are grounds to contest this, he said. Real grounds. We can request a competency review on the will's final revision. We can delay probate months, possibly longer, but it buys leverage. It forces them to negotiate instead of dictate terms to a grieving widow like she's some line item on a spreadsheet. And how do I live during those months, I asked him. Because that was the question sitting underneath every other question, the one that had kept me staring at that ceiling half the night. A fight sounds noble inside a lawyer's office. It sounds like something else entirely when you're the one still paying the mortgage on a house you might not even keep with a debt collector already circling somewhere just out of sight. I didn't have a good answer for that. Good lawyers rarely do when the plain truth is that justice moves slowly and hunger does not wait politely for it to catch up. So I told him something I hadn't fully decided to tell him until the words were already halfway out of my mouth. I told him I wanted to sign. All of it. Give them exactly what they were asking for, quickly, cleanly, no contest, no delay, no fight anyone could later point to and say I had chosen. He looked at me like I had just told him I was moving to the moon that same afternoon. You can't be serious, he said. I told him. Though even as the words left me, I could feel the lie sitting sideways in my chest because I was not giving up anything. I was doing something else entirely. Something I did not yet have a name for, something that had started the exact moment I watched Chaska pace that driveway, like a man standing on ground that wasn't nearly as solid as he'd been promised it would be. Sahel studied me for a long moment, the kind of look he probably gave clients right before he told them the truth, whether they wanted it or not. In 30 years, he said finally, I have never once had a client walk away from an estate like this without a fight. Something is missing here, Winona. Something you are not telling me. I was right, of course. But I wasn't ready yet to tell him about the key. Not because I didn't trust him. Because I didn't yet know what it opened, and a woman does not hand a half-formed weapon to anyone. Not even a friend, not even a good one, until she understands exactly what it is she's putting into someone else's hands. Draft something, I told him. Let them think they've already won. He drafted it slowly, reluctantly, every clause written like a man laying stones over a grave he did not personally believe belonged in the ground yet. I sat across from him while he worked, watching the particular way his pen hesitated at certain lines, as though some part of him kept hoping I'd change my mind before he finished the next paragraph. I didn't. Whatever this cost me later, I understood even then that I needed this piece of paper to exist in the world, exactly as much as I needed everything still waiting for me at that cabin, because a woman who appears to have surrendered completely draws far less suspicion than one who hesitates. And I drove home with the paper sitting in my bag on the passenger seat, and the key still in my coat pocket where it had been ever since the night before, where I had not let it out of arm's reach since the moment I found it. I spent the whole of that day searching the house. Every drawer, every closet, the gun safe in the back hallway, the filing cabinet in the mudroom stuffed with decades of tax returns, even the old steamer trunk up in the attic that hadn't been opened since we packed away the Christmas decorations years ago, back when Neshoba could still climb that attic ladder without needing to stop halfway up to catch his breath. There is a particular kind of grief that only shows up in the middle of a task like that, not in the big moments. Everyone expects to be hard, the funeral, the empty side of the bed. But in the small ones, nobody warns you about finding his handwriting on an old grocery list, stuck to the back of a drawer, or the specific brand of aspirin he preferred still sitting half full in the medicine cabinet where he'd left it. I sat down on the bathroom floor once that afternoon, simply holding that bottle, and I let myself cry in a way I hadn't allowed since the burial itself, not out of any renewed shock, but simply because grief. I was learning does not move in a straight line no matter how much a person wishes it would. In the back of the hall closet, I found a shoebox of photographs neither of us had ever gotten around to putting into albums, mostly early years. The workshop half built the lodge, just a frame of raw lumber against the sky. One photograph stopped me completely, the two of us standing in front of that half-finished lodge. Both of us younger and sunburned and laughing at the camera, Chenoa's thumb visible at the edge of the frame where she'd nearly cut herself out of the shot taking the picture. I sat with that photograph a long while before setting the box aside, understanding even then that grief has a way of ambushing you through exactly the objects you least expect to matter. I called Chenoa around 4 that afternoon, more out of frustration than anything else, and told her I was starting to feel foolish. An old woman crawling around her own attic, chasing a feeling instead of a fact. She didn't try to talk me out of the feeling. She only asked me one question, the same question she'd asked me 100 times over 40 years of friendship whenever I was talking myself out of trusting my own instincts. She asked whether the feeling had gotten smaller since that morning, or bigger. I told her bigger if I was honest. Then keep looking, she said, and hung up before I could argue with her about it, the way only a friend of that many years can hang up on you and have it feel like an act of love rather than rudeness. Nothing fit. The key sat cold and useless against lock after lock after lock until I started to wonder whether I had built an entire private mythology around a piece of scrap metal that meant absolutely nothing at all, some forgotten thing from a hardware store decades gone that had simply outlived its own purpose. By late afternoon, my knees ached from crouching in front of cabinets. My hands were gray with dust from the back of the linen closet, and twice I sat down flat on the hallway floor, simply to breathe, surrounded by boxes of photographs and old birthday cards I hadn't touched in years, each one its own small, unexpected wound waiting patiently to be opened. Except Neshoba never kept things that meant nothing, not in 24 years of marriage. Even his junk drawer had a logic to it if you looked long enough, if you understood the particular order a careful man imposes on even his smallest belongings. So I made myself stop tearing through the house and start thinking instead, really thinking about where a man like him would hide something he wanted only me and no one else on this earth to eventually find. And that was when I thought of the fishing cabin. It sat at the far edge of Ash Ridge, well past the last fence line down where the pasture finally gave way to cottonwoods and the river bent hard toward the east. His grandfather had built it with his own hands, and his father had added on to it after that one small room with a wood stove and a narrow bunk and a single window that looked straight down the length of the water. Neshoba used to go out there alone sometimes, especially in that last year, telling me he needed quiet to think that the fish were never really the point of it. I never once asked him what he was actually thinking about out there alone with the wood stove ticking and the river running past. I wish now more than almost anything else that I had. We used to go out there together in our early years before the workshop and the lodge took up every spare hour we had between us. I remember one particular evening, maybe our 3rd or 4th summer married, when we sat on that sagging porch step until well past dark, not fishing at all, just watching the river catch what little light was left in the sky. He told me that night that his grandfather had built the cabin as a place to think through hard decisions, away from the noise of the main house, and that he intended to keep it exactly that way for as long as the land belonged to a blackbird. I hadn't thought of that conversation in years until I stood in that same doorway holding a brass key, understanding all at once precisely what kind of hard decision he'd been thinking through out here alone in his final months. I walked out there in the last hour of daylight, my boots sinking into ground still soft from an early frost that had thawed off by noon. The cottonwoods along the river had already started dropping their leaves early that year, gold scattered thick across the path. The way it always seemed to happen right after something in a person's life had quietly ended, as though the land itself kept its own private calendar of grief separate from the one on the wall. And a hawk sat watching me from a fence post the whole way out, unbothered patient, the kind of stillness I found myself envying more than I expected to that particular afternoon. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. It weathered gray, the porch steps sagging on one side the way it had for years without either of us ever quite getting around to fixing it one of those small chores you keep meaning to do until the person who would have done it with you is gone, and the chore itself becomes something else entirely, something closer to a wound. I hadn't been inside since before he got sick. The door was unlocked. It always was out there, because who would ever bother driving that far out just to steal a fishing rod and a coffee tin full of hooks? But inside, tucked beneath the bunk where the floorboard had been cut and refitted so carefully that I never would have noticed it if I hadn't been looking for exactly this, was a wooden chest. Small, iron banded at every corner, and a lock on the front of it that was unmistakably the same worn brass as the key sitting heavy in my coat pocket. My hands were not steady when I finally turned it. Inside there was a notebook, the plain black composition kind you'd buy off a drugstore shelf for a couple of dollars, filled cover to cover in Neshoba's handwriting. The same careful block print he used for every ledger he had ever kept in his life. Dates, names, numbers that meant nothing to me at first glance, and then as I kept reading meant absolutely everything. There was also a small handheld recorder tucked beside it, the kind with an actual cassette still loaded inside the plastic casing, gone slightly brittle with age, the sort of thing you'd find at the back of a drawer in a house that hadn't fully caught up to the last 20 years of technology. I read the notebook first, sitting on the edge of that narrow bunk with the last of the daylight slanting low through the window, and the deeper I went, the colder that cabin seemed to get. Though I don't think the temperature in the room had anything to do with it at all. He had started writing it 11 months before he died. Before the diagnosis even, which was the detail that stopped my breath entirely, because it meant that whatever he had started watching, he had begun watching long before either of us had any idea his own body was already quietly betraying him. The first entries were small things, the kind you wouldn't think twice about on their own. A call from Chaska asking unusually specific questions about the workshop's accounts, questions that had nothing to do with saddles or cabinetry and everything to do with valuation. A visit from Kaylee that ended, according to Neshoba's careful notation, with him quietly photographing paperwork in the office, while he believed Neshoba was still in the kitchen making coffee. Nothing damning on its own, taken one entry at a time. Just small stones, the kind you don't notice at all, until someone points out much later that they've quietly been building into a wall around you. There were smaller entries, too, scattered between the larger ones, the kind that only made sense once I understood what he'd been watching for. A note about Kale borrowing the truck for a weekend and returning it with the odometer showing a round trip to Reno rather than the fishing trip he'd claimed. A note about Chaska asking too casually whether Neshoba had ever considered moving the workshop's accounts into a trust, phrased like idle conversation, but written down here with a small question mark beside it that told me exactly how little Neshoba had believed the idle part of it. One entry dated a full month before the diagnosis simply read, Keeley asked again about the lodge appraisal today. 3rd time this year. Told him I hadn't thought about it. That was a lie. Reading Neshoba admit to a lie in his own careful handwriting, even one so small, told me more about how seriously he'd started taking all of this than almost anything else in that notebook. This was not a man keeping a casual list of small annoyances. This was a man building a case one lie of his own included against 2 sons he clearly still hoped might prove him wrong before it was over. Then the entries changed. There was a name I didn't recognize anywhere in it. Denny Ashcroft. According to the notebook, a man Chaska had brought into a series of conversations about, and I am quoting the words in Neshoba's own hand, almost exactly restructuring the estate before probate becomes a problem. There was a date beside that entry that made my stomach drop straight through the floorboards of that cabin, because it placed the conversation nearly a full year before Neshoba's death, which meant this had never once been grief-driven, whatever cover story either son might later try to offer for it, which meant Chaska had been quietly building toward this exact outcome, while his father was still perfectly healthy, still working the ranch every single morning, still laughing at the kitchen table like a man with easy decades left ahead of him. I sat with that fact for a long, long moment, because it is one thing to suspect your husband's grown children of being cold toward you. It is another thing entirely to hold physical proof in your own 2 hands that they had been quietly counting down toward his death, while he was still perfectly alive, to smile at them across a table. I pressed play on the recorder next, my thumb trembling hard against the small worn button. The tape hissed for the few seconds before the voices finally came through, tinny and distant, clearly recorded on a phone left carelessly on a table somewhere, rather than through any kind of deliberate wiretap. I recognized Chaska immediately. The second voice took me a moment longer to place until Ashcroft's name surfaced again partway through the conversation, and I understood exactly who I was listening to. Chaska's voice flat and entirely businesslike. He's not going to last the year the doctors are saying now. We need the shell entities filed before probate opens, otherwise she gets a say in things she has no business having a say in. And the reply calmer colder somehow for being so calm. She won't be a problem. She doesn't understand the accounts. By the time she figures out anything is even missing, it'll already be restructured past the point where a widow's lawyer can untangle it. I played it a second time before I let myself believe my own ears. Some small, stubborn part of me still hoping the first pass had been a trick of a tired mind grieving in an unheated cabin. It hadn't been. The second listen landed exactly as hard as the first, maybe harder, because by then I no longer had the excuse of shock to soften it. I turned the recorder off with a hand that did not feel like my own hand anymore, because there it was. Not suspicion this time, not grief talking, not an old woman's imagination running wild in an empty cabin. Proof in his own recorded voice that my stepson had spent the final year of his father's life quietly building a structure specifically designed to erase me before his own father was even in the ground. I sat with the recorder in my lap a long while after I finally turned it off, listening instead to the ordinary sounds of the cabin settling around me, the wood stove ticking as it cooled the river, moving steadily past the window, the same way it had moved past that window for 100 years, regardless of what any of us did with our short lives beside it. I found myself thinking oddly of the two of them as small boys' photographs I had seen in albums from before I ever entered this family gap, toothed and grinning in a way neither of them grinned anymore. I wondered when exactly that grin had curdled into whatever I'd just heard on that tape. Whether there had been one specific afternoon I could point to, if I looked hard enough, or whether it had simply happened the way most rot happens slowly in the dark unnoticed, until the whole beam finally gives way under weight it was never tested against. I don't know exactly how long I sat in that cabin after the tape finally clicked to a stop. Long enough that the light through the window went from gray to nearly black. Long enough that the cold finally started to matter, seeping slowly up through the floorboards into my knees, into my hands, into the particular place behind my ribs, where something had been sitting frozen solid since the funeral, and was only now finally beginning to move again. There was one more thing waiting in the chest. A folded paper tucked into the back cover of the notebook, and on it, in Neshoba's writing, a single line and a number. An account name I did not recognize at all. A balance that made me read it 3 separate times before I let myself believe it. Just under $3.9 million. We had never had that kind of money. Not in any account I had ever once seen the statements for, not in any conversation the two of us had ever had late at night, doing the careful arithmetic of a modest, comfortable retirement, counting years and expenses on the back of an envelope the way ordinary people do. Which meant he had built something else entirely, somewhere separate, quietly and deliberately, well out of reach of 2 sons he no longer trusted with a single dollar of it. The walk back to the house felt longer than the walk out had, though the distance itself hadn't changed at all. The cottonwoods had gone fully dark by then, the river no longer visible except as a sound moving somewhere off to my right, and I found myself talking quietly to Neshoba the whole way back, telling him I understood, now telling him I was sorry it had taken me this long to go looking. The cold had settled in hard by the time Ash Ridge's porch light finally came into view, and I remember standing at the bottom of the steps for a moment before going inside, letting myself feel the full weight of the chest in my arms, one last time before I set it down and became officially someone who knew. I carried that chest back to the house myself that night, both arms wrapped tight around it like something that might shatter if I wasn't careful, though. Of course, nothing inside it was fragile in the slightest. Everything inside it was exactly the opposite of fragile. It was armor. It had been sitting quietly under that floorboard for months, patient waiting for me to finally be ready to pick it up and carry its weight. I didn't sleep again that second night either. I sat in his office with the notebook open on the desk in front of me, rereading certain entries until the words blurred together, until I could recite whole passages of them without even looking down at the page. And somewhere close to midnight, sitting there in the quiet with the ledger and the tape, and that impossible folded number resting in my lap, I understood something that changed the entire shape of everything still to come. Neshoba had not left me poor. He had left me armed. He had known long before I ever did exactly what his sons were capable of, and instead of confronting them directly while he still had the strength left to fight, he had chosen something slower, something colder in its own careful way. He had built a trail piece by piece, month by month, and left it behind for the one person he trusted to eventually follow it all the way to its end. I thought about Sahail's face in his office that morning, the confusion threaded through his voice when he asked what I wasn't telling him. I thought about the papers Chaska had left waiting on the desk, and for the first time since the funeral, the thought of signing them didn't feel like surrender at all anymore. It felt like bait. I even laughed once alone in that kitchen at nearly midnight, a short, startled sound that surprised me more than it would have surprised anyone watching, because it was the first time since the funeral that anything at all had struck me as darkly, bitterly funny, the two of them. So certain they had already won a war, I hadn't even told them we were fighting. I finally slept a few hours before dawn, curled in Neshoba's old reading chair, rather than the bed, the notebook still open on my lap, and I woke stiff and cold to gray light coming through the office window, disoriented for a moment about where I was and why my neck ached the way it did. It took several seconds for the previous night to come flooding back, and when it did, I found the fear from the day before had settled overnight into something steadier, something closer to resolve. My phone rang just after 7 the following morning, an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen and a voice I had never once heard before, calm and entirely unhurried in a way that raised the hair along both my arms before he had even finished his very first sentence. "Mrs. Blackbird," he said, "my name is Ahanu Stormcloud. Your husband asked me some months ago now to reach out to you if certain circumstances came to pass. I believe those circumstances have now come to pass." I asked him how he could possibly know how he could know anything at all about what I had found in that cabin only hours before. He didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he said the words that kept me standing frozen in the kitchen with the phone pressed hard against my ear long after he had already hung up. "There are things about your husband's estate you need to fully understand before you sign anything. And anything Chaska and Kaylee put in front of you," he said. "Everything. Please do not sign a single page until the two of us have spoken." I asked him before he could hang up how he had gotten my number in the first place, whether Neshoba had simply handed it over months ago in case this exact call ever needed making. He was quiet for a moment on the line, and then he told me that Neshoba had given him far more than my number, that he had given him instructions detailed enough to fill a folder of their own instructions, written and rewritten over several visits, as though he kept revising them right up until his body no longer let him drive out to that ranch house office anymore. That detail alone kept me standing at the counter a long while after we finally said goodbye, turning it over the way I turned over everything else that week. That week, understanding a little more clearly each time. Exactly how long my husband had been quietly building something meant only for a version of the future he never got to live inside. I looked down at the folder Sahaley had drafted, sitting closed on the kitchen counter where I had left it the night before, papers that would have quietly handed over every last acre of Ash Ridge without a fight of any kind. My hand was steady when I picked the phone back up to call him again. Tomorrow, I told Ahanu Stormcloud. Tell me where. Ahanu Stormcloud's office was nothing at all like Sahal's. No feed store smell, no 40 years of coffee soaked into the walls. His practice sat inside a converted ranch house 20 minutes outside town land law books stacked floor to ceiling in every direction, and when he opened the door himself, instead of sending some receptionist out to greet me, I understood immediately that this was a man who worked alone because he trusted almost no one else to touch what mattered most to him. His waiting room held exactly one chair and no receptionist's desk at all, and a single framed photograph on the wall of a river bend I recognized immediately as our own taken, I would learn later, the same autumn. Neshoba first walked through that door looking for someone who owed nothing to anyone else already circling his estate. Ahanu practiced almost entirely on land disputes, water rights boundary claims that stretched back generations, the kind of work that required a man to be patient with paper, the way a rancher is patient with weather, waiting it out rather than forcing it. I had heard his name mentioned once or twice over the years, always in the same careful tone people use for someone they respect, but have never personally needed. He was the lawyer families called when a boundary line got contested 3 generations after the original survey, when a will written in the 1960s suddenly mattered again because somebody's grandchild wanted to sell what everyone else considered sacred. He did not advertise. He did not need to. His reputation, as far as I understood, it had been built one quiet, correctly handled case at a time over decades, in a county where everyone eventually needed exactly that kind of patience at least once. He was gentler than I had expected from his voice on the phone. Soft-spoken, older in person than that voice had suggested, his hands folded neatly on the desk like a man long used to delivering news that broke people slowly, piece by careful piece rather than all at once in a single blow. "Your husband came to me 11 months ago," he said. "Not for a will, not at first. He came because he was worried about how the land would eventually be divided if something happened to him, and he wanted someone entirely outside his usual circle to look at the whole picture with clean eyes. He came to me specifically," Ahanu added before I could ask, "because he wanted someone who understood land, the way his own grandfather had understood it, not simply as a number on an appraisal, but as something held in trust across generations, Something a man doesn't get to simply liquidate to the highest bidder among his own children, without first asking whether they'd earned the right to hold it after him. That mattered to your husband more than the money ever did, Ahanu told me. He said as much to me directly more than once sitting in that very chair you're sitting in now. I sat quietly with that for a moment before I finally found my voice enough to ask him what exactly he meant by outside his usual circle. He meant Sahaley's office, Ahanu said, and he watched my face carefully as he said it, the way a doctor watches a patient's face right before delivering something he already knows will hurt going down. Neshoba believed information was leaving that office before he wanted it to leave. He never once said who specifically. He only said he could no longer be certain a single document stayed private once it crossed that particular threshold. Something in my chest went very still, because Sahaley had sat beside me at that hospital. Sahaley had sat with me in silence for 2 hours straight when I couldn't manage to speak a single word. I did not want to believe that trust had a leak somewhere inside it, and yet here was a complete stranger telling me gently that my own husband had believed exactly that and had believed it strongly enough to act on it in secret. I asked Ahanu whether Neshoba had ever named names, whether he'd said outright that he suspected Sahaley himself rather than someone simply working in that office. Ahanu shook his head. He told me Neshoba had been careful never to accuse the man directly unwilling to damage a friendship of 15 years on a suspicion he couldn't fully prove choosing, instead to simply root around the risk entirely rather than confront it. That too felt like Neshoba through and through, protecting even the people he no longer fully trusted from the full weight of an accusation he wasn't certain he could stand behind. Ahanu slid a folder across the desk toward me, thicker than the one Chaska had brought out to Ash Ridge. Heavier somehow, though it was only paper-only ink on a page. This is the will your husband actually signed, he said, 6 weeks before he died. The one Chaska showed you is real. It isn't a forgery, but it's an earlier draft. Superseded. He never told either of his sons that a newer version even existed. I opened it with hands that did not particularly want to cooperate with me. Legal language dense and careful, until I finally found the clause. Ahanu had already underlined in pencil for me, sparing me from having to hunt for it through my own grief. I leave to my wife, Winona Blackbird, full and sole discretion over what my sons Chaska and Kaylee shall receive from my estate, trusting her judgment above any claim of blood. I read it 3 separate times. Not because I didn't understand the words, because I could not quite believe that a man could love someone enough to hand her that particular kind of power on paper, fully knowing exactly what it would eventually cost her to use it well. I thought of every quiet dinner where I'd swallowed some small slight from one of his sons rather than make a scene of it for his sake. Every holiday where I'd stepped back a little further than I wanted to, so the room could feel more like theirs than mine. He had watched all of that too, apparently in his own quiet way, filing it away the same careful method he filed everything else, and had decided somewhere in the middle of all that, watching that I had earned more say in this family's future than either of the 2 people who shared his blood. I didn't want revenge, Ahanu said, watching me read it a 4th time. He was very clear about that in every single conversation the 2 of us ever had. He wanted the choice to belong to you and only you. Whatever you eventually decided, he wanted it to be yours, to decide, not his, to dictate from beyond the grave. I asked him how a document this significant could exist for 6 weeks without either of his sons ever catching wind of it. Ahanu explained that Neshoba had signed it here in this very office, witnessed only by Ahanu's own longtime assistant, and a notary who owed Ahanu enough professional favors over the years to keep a confidence without asking unnecessary questions. No copies had gone anywhere else. No filing had happened with the county until it needed to. Your husband understood, Ahanu told me, that the only will that matters is the one nobody gets a chance to argue against before it's ready to be read. I sat with that for a long moment, because it would have been so much simpler for a dying man to write his sons out of the will, entirely clean and final, no ambiguity left behind for anyone to later argue over in a courtroom. He hadn't done that. He had built something far harder instead. A door he trusted only me to walk through, with no map waiting on the other side to tell me which direction was the right one. I asked Ahanu before we moved any further what would happen to the 30-day notice Chaska had given me, whether I was still legally bound by whatever timeline he'd set once this real will came to light. Ahanu told me plainly that Chaska's 30 days had never held any legal weight at all, that it had been nothing more than pressure, dressed up as procedure, the kind of deadline people invent when they're hoping fear will do the work that law can't. You were never actually required to leave that house on anyone's clock but your own, he said. Somebody wanted you to believe otherwise, and believing it was exactly the point. I told Ahanu everything about the fishing cabin, the notebook, the tape. He listened without once interrupting me, and when I finally finished, he nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he had already privately suspected but never quite had proof of before now. "There's more you should know," he said. "And I think you need to hear the rest of it from someone who has spent 30 years watching families come apart over land like this. You should talk to Ohansey Nightwalker." I knew the name already. Everyone in that county eventually came to know the name the way you know the name of the one person who used to wear a badge and now spends his retirement quietly finding the things other people worked very hard to keep buried. Ahanu wrote the number down himself on a small scrap of paper and told me plainly to call before I did anything else at all, before I signed a single page, before I answered another message from either of my stepsons. I called that very same afternoon. Driving out to meet him, I noticed something in myself that hadn't been there 3 weeks earlier, a steadiness underneath the fear rather than instead of it. I was still afraid sitting at that stoplight on the edge of town, afraid of what I might learn, afraid of what it might cost me to know it, and afraid in some smaller way of who I might become in the knowing. But the fear no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt more like where I had decided to walk through anyway because the alternative, turning the truck around and driving back to sign whatever papers were waiting on my counter, felt like a much colder kind of surrender than any storm I might meet head-on. Ohansey met me at a diner just outside town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never once seemed to stop moving between tables. The same waitress working the counter, she'd likely been working for 20 years, calling half the customers by name without needing to glance at a ticket. I picked a booth in the back out of habit, more than caution, the same instinct that made me sit facing the door in any room since the funeral, as though some part of me had started expecting bad news to arrive from a specific direction and wanted enough warning to brace for it. He was older than I had pictured, from his voice, silver-haired, quiet in his movements, in the way that comes only from decades spent watching people lie to your face and learning one small tell at a time exactly which flicker of the eyes gives it away. He didn't ask why I wanted to know what he was about to tell me. He simply opened a manila envelope on the table between us and let the truth do the talking for him. He'd worn a badge for 31 years in this county before he retired. He told me at one point, unprompted stirring sugar into coffee, he didn't seem to actually want. Spent the back half of that career watching elder fraud cases get quietly dropped for lack of resources. Families too embarrassed to press charges against their own blood prosecutors, too stretched thin to chase paper trails that led nowhere fast enough to justify the hours. He didn't retire out of tiredness, he said. He retired so he could finally work the cases nobody else had the patience for on his own clock for whoever needed it enough to ask. "Most of what I do now is just patience dressed up as skill," he told me, tapping the folder between us. "Public records anybody could pull if they knew where to look. A few favors still owed to me from the old badge called in carefully, sparingly, because a favor spent carelessly is a favor you don't get to use twice. And conversations mostly sitting across from people the way I'm sitting across from you now, letting them tell me things in their own time instead of trying to drag it out of them. Most fraud isn't clever, Mrs. Blackbird. It's just quiet, and quiet is easy to miss if nobody's specifically looking for it. Chaska Blackbird, he said, currently has $275,000 in outstanding debt. Most of it tied to a series of trips out to Reno over the past 18 months. Casino records. Credit lines he's been rolling from one card onto the next just to keep the minimum payments current. His firm doesn't know. Not yet, anyway. I stared down at the photographs he slid across the table toward me. My stepson walking out through a casino entrance at 2 in the morning. Ty loosened the particular posture of a man who has just lost something he could not afford to lose, and is already in that exact moment thinking hard about how to win it back somewhere else before the sun comes up. It started small, Ohansey added, the way he seemed to add most of the hardest details quietly after the initial shock had already landed. A few hundred here and there 3 years back, the kind of thing a man with his income could absorb without much trouble. It's the last 18 months that got away from him. Once the amounts got big enough that losing bothered him, the trips got more frequent instead of less, which is usually how it goes. People chase the number that would fix it, and the chasing is what actually breaks them. Keeley's is worse, Ohansey said, and something in his voice hardened slightly as he said it, the first real flicker of emotion he'd shown me since I'd sat down across from him. His consulting business is mostly empty. What isn't empty is a pattern of him managing retirement accounts for older clients right here in this county. People in their 70s, their 80s. 3 separate families have already filed informal complaints against him, over funds that never quite matched what they were originally told they'd have waiting for them. I felt something twist low in my stomach, sharp and sick all at once, because I had sat across a dinner table from that man more times than I could count. I had watched him pour wine for his own wife with an easy smile on his face, while somewhere else in this same county, an elderly widow was sitting alone staring at a retirement statement with far less money in it than she had spent 30 years being promised. "There's one in particular," O'Hansey said, and he paused before he said it. The pause of a man deciding whether a stranger deserved the full weight of a name. Vera Talltrees, 81 years old, out past the county line. Keeley managed her late husband's pension rollover starting about 4 years back. She came to me herself quiet about it, embarrassed the way people her age often are about money, convinced somehow that losing it was her own fault for not paying closer attention. It wasn't her fault. Not $1 of it. I asked him how much. Just under 60,000, he said. Money meant to carry her through the rest of her life. Gone into accounts your stepson controlled, dressed up in paperwork, complicated enough that she couldn't follow where it had actually gone, only that it wasn't there anymore when she finally needed it. She still drives out to that same church every Sunday. O'Hansey added quieter now, as though the fact mattered to him personally beyond the folder in front of us. Doesn't tell anyone in her congregation a word about any of it. Just quietly figures out which bills wait another month and which ones don't, and keeps that math entirely to herself. That's the part that never sits right with me in cases like this. It's never loud. It's just small private math done alone over and over until there's nothing left to do math with. He's careful, O'Hansey went on. Nothing provable yet in a strictly criminal sense, not on its own. But it's a pattern, and patterns like that rarely stay quiet forever. Eventually somebody with the right resources looks hard enough, and eventually somebody just did. I asked him what all of this meant for me, specifically sitting across from him in that cracked vinyl booth with my hands wrapped tight around a coffee cup gone cold an hour ago. He told me Vera wasn't the only name in that particular folder, only the one he'd chosen to walk me through in detail. There were 2 others he mentioned only in passing, an elderly couple 2 towns over who'd signed papers they didn't fully understand, and a widower out past the reservoir whose complaint had been filed and then quietly withdrawn a month later, the kind of withdrawal O'Hansey said he'd learned to read as its own kind of confession. A family deciding shame was easier to live with than a lawsuit against their own blood. Patterns like this rarely stayed contained to just one victim, he told me. Men who learned they could take from a stranger without consequence eventually stopped being able to tell the difference between a stranger and anyone else standing close enough to reach. O'Hansey looked at me for a long moment before he finally answered, the look of a man carefully weighing exactly how much weight a person can carry before something inside them breaks under it. "It means your husband wasn't wrong to be afraid," he said. "And it means you are the only person left standing right now who gets to decide what happens to that fear." I drove home from that diner with both hands locked tight on the wheel, the folder sitting on the passenger seat like something radioactive, and I did not go straight back to Ash Ridge. I went out to the cabin instead because some part of me already understood, before I'd even reached the gate, that the last of it was still waiting for me out there. There was a second envelope in the very bottom of that iron-banded chest. I had missed it entirely the first night, buried beneath the notebook sealed shut. My own name written across the front in handwriting I would recognize anywhere on this earth, even now, even after everything I had already learned. I sat on the edge of that narrow bunk in the fading light, and I opened it. "My dearest Winona," it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment because seeing his handwriting form those particular words undid something in me that all the folders and recordings in the world hadn't managed to touch yet. I traced my thumb along the top line before I let myself keep reading the way you might touch a photograph of someone you miss, as though enough contact with the paper itself could somehow carry a little of him back through it. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have already found more than I ever wanted you to have to find on your own. I am sorry for that. I am sorry I could not simply tell you all of this while I was still alive to say it to your face, but I needed to be certain of what they were actually planning before I put any of it into your hands. A suspicion is not a weapon, Winona. Proof is." He wrote that he had grown uneasy almost a year before the diagnosis, watching his sons circle closer the exact moment his health first started to falter. Not out of love, he wrote, but out of some old, well-practiced instinct for timing that he recognized in them, because he had seen it once before in other families and other men who had learned early that grief creates a window, and windows can be climbed through if you move quickly enough. He wrote that he had quietly moved the bulk of what we owned into an account only I could reach the same one Ohansey had already confirmed sat at just under $3.9 million untouched, waiting patiently for me the whole time. Then I turned the page slowly, some instinct already warning me the next part would be harder to read than anything that had come before it. And the letter told me the part that made the entire room around me go very cold. The boys believe they are inheriting Ash Ridge and the lodge free and clear, he wrote. What they do not know is that I took out mortgages against both properties during my final year quietly through channels neither of them would ever think to check on their own. Together, once the appraisals and the debt are weighed properly against each other, what remains is a deficit of roughly $320,000. They are not inheriting land Winona. They are inheriting a hole with land shaped around the edges of it. I read that particular line 4 separate times before it fully landed in me, each pass making the number underneath. It feel a little more real, a little less like something I could still talk myself out of believing. Because it meant every single number Chaska had recited so confidently in that office 900,623,350. All of it dressed up like triumph was hollow underneath all the way through. It meant the folder he had opened with such theatrical care had been quietly built on a foundation his own father had already removed months before either son had thought to look for it. I turned another page and found him writing about the workshop of all things, as though even in the middle of building his case against his own sons, he could not help but circle back to the place we had built together with our own hands. I want you to keep the shop running if you have it in you, he wrote. Not because it makes money, though it does, but because I have watched you become someone in that building that I do not think you ever got to be anywhere else in your life before me. Don't let anyone talk you into selling it quietly just to simplify things. Simple is not always the same as right. Reading that line sitting alone in that cabin, I understood he had thought not only about how to protect me from his sons, but about who I might become once the protecting was finally finished. The letter went on. He wrote about the life insurance next, correcting a number I hadn't even thought to question yet, telling me the real policy sat at $300,000. Not the $150,000 Keeley had claimed sitting in Neshoba's own office that very first day, the difference alone nearly wiping out the medical debt they had tried to hang around my neck, like a stone tied for drowning. He wrote that he had documented everything Ohansey would later confirm independently. Every gambling debt, every quiet complaint filed against Kaylee's business, every single conversation Chaska had ever had with Denny Ashcroft about restructuring the estate before his own father was even cold in the ground. There was one more thing I want you to know. He wrote in that same careful hand before you close this letter and decide what happens next. I have not stopped loving them, even now, even knowing what I know. A father does not get to simply switch that off because his sons disappointed him, no more than you could switch off loving a piece of land just because a flood came through and ruined a season's planting on it. What I have done is not about loving them less. It is about refusing to let that love be the exact thing they use against the woman who actually earned it. And then near the very bottom of the page in handwriting that looked noticeably shakier than the rest, like it had been written on a particularly hard day, when even holding the pen steady had cost him something, he wrote the sentence that stayed with me longest of anything in that whole letter. I know this will look cruel to people who don't understand what I saw with my own eyes. It is not cruelty. It is consequence. They made their choices while I was still breathing Winona. Now they will have to live inside the shape of them. You are the only one I trust to decide how much mercy that shape should have room left inside it for. I sat in that cabin until the light had gone completely, the letter loose in my lap, Ohansey's folder resting beside me on the bunk, the will from Ahanu still creased from where I had folded it too tightly in the car on the drive over. 3 separate documents. 3 different men who had each in their own particular way handed me one more piece of the same larger truth. Outside, the river kept moving past the window exactly the way it always had, indifferent to any of it, and I found something steadying in that indifference, the reminder that the water would keep running long after this particular reckoning had finished playing itself out, long after all of us were gone from this land, the way Neshoba now was. My husband had not left me poor and afraid in a house about to be taken out from under me. He had left me the one thing that mattered more than any amount of money ever could. He had left me certainty. And for the first time since I had watched his casket lowered into ground, his own grandfather had once walked across on horseback, I understood exactly what I was going to do with it. I thought about Chaska pacing that driveway phone pressed hard to his ear weeks earlier now, though it already felt like a different lifetime entirely. I thought about the folder he had closed with that small, satisfied click, so certain he was walking away the clear winner of something. I thought about the dinner still sitting ahead of me on his calendar, the one Adsila had already texted twice to confirm family time before we finalize everything, as though a shared meal could paper over the size of what he already suspected might be coming for him. He did not know yet what he had actually inherited. Neither of them did. I thought too about the version of this story where I simply drove to Chaska's office the very next morning and laid every document out on his desk without waiting another day. It would have been easier in some ways, faster, less costly to whatever nerve it was taking to sit across a dinner table from two men and pretend not to know what I knew. But Neshoba had not built this trail for speed. He had built it for certainty, layer after layer of it, and I understood sitting in that cold cabin that rushing toward the reveal now would only waste the one advantage he had spent his final year quietly handing me. And so sitting alone in that cold little cabin with my husband's last letter, still faintly warm from my own hands, I made the decision that would carry me straight into the hardest room I would ever have to sit inside for the rest of my life. I would let them keep believing just a little while longer that the folder on that desk had told the whole story of what was coming. It would cost me something to wait. I already knew that much sitting there in the dark. Patience always costs something, but it would cost them far more in the end. And I found turning that thought over one last time before I finally rose from that bunk and carried everything back out into the cold that I could live with that particular trade far more easily than I could have lived with rushing toward a reckoning I hadn't yet fully understood myself. Because the moment they finally discovered otherwise, I intended to be the only one left holding every remaining page. The dinner invitation came from Keel 2 days after I left that cabin. For the second time, his voice warm over the phone in a way that had once fooled me completely, and now only made my jaw tighten reflexively, an old muscle memory of politeness, fighting against everything I now knew to be true underneath it. Family time, he called it before we finalize everything. I said yes. I said it sounds lovely. And I hated in a small, quiet way how easily those words came, how many years of careful practice it had taken to build a voice that could sound perfectly pleasant, while everything underneath it had already gone completely to iron. I told Chenoa about the dinner before I told anyone else sitting at her kitchen table the afternoon before watching her roll pie dough with the particular ferocity of a woman working out feelings she hadn't quite found words for yet. She didn't tell me not to go. She knew me well enough by then to understand that I was not walking into that house as a victim anymore, whatever performance I intended to give once I got there. She only made me repeat back to her twice exactly what I intended to say, and what I intended to hold back the way she used to quiz me on horse names as girls, until she was satisfied I had the order of it memorized cold. "You are not the same woman who sat in that office weeks ago," she told me, flour dusting the backs of her hands. "Don't let your face forget that even while the rest of you is being polite." She asked me once, setting the rolling pin down flat on the table, whether any part of me still wanted their approval, even now, even knowing everything I knew. I sat with the question longer than I expected to before I answered it honestly. Some small, stubborn part of me still did, I told her. 24 years is a long time to want to belong somewhere, and that wanting doesn't switch itself off just because the people you wanted it from turned out to be capable of things you never imagined. Chenoa only nodded at that, no judgment in it at all, and told me wanting it and needing to act on it were two entirely separate animals. And I was allowed to keep the first one quietly caged somewhere in my chest, while I did whatever the second one required of me anyway. I drove out to Keel's place the following evening, with her words still sitting somewhere behind my ribs, steadying me the whole way. Adsila answered the door in a dress that had clearly cost more than I wanted to spend any time thinking about her smile arranged the particular way some women arrange flowers purely for effect, rather than any feeling underneath it. She kissed the air near my cheek and told me I looked wonderful, and I thanked her, and neither one of us meant a single word of it, though we both said it beautifully. Keel's house sat behind a wide circular driveway with 2 cars parked in it that had no business belonging to a man whose consulting business, according to the folder now sitting locked in my own filing cabinet at home, brought in almost nothing worth mentioning. I understood now with a kind of sick clarity exactly where the money for those 2 cars had actually come from. An old woman named Vera Talltrees, somewhere out past the county line among the people who had quietly financed them without ever meaning to. The understanding sat in my stomach like a stone the entire evening, a weight I carried through every course of that meal, without once letting it show on my face. The house itself smelled like the candles Adsila always burned before company came, something expensive and floral that didn't quite mask the newer, faker smell underneath it, Fresh paint over drywall that hadn't fully cured the whole place, still slightly under construction in ways nobody mentioned out loud. I noticed a delivery box from some high-end furniture company still sitting unopened in the hallway, and I thought walking past it about how many of Vera Taltreese's dollars might be sitting inside that box waiting to become a coffee table nobody in this house had actually earned. Chaska was already in the study when I arrived, a glass of something amber in his hand, and he stood to hug me with an ease that made my skin want to crawl straight off my own body. "You're looking better," he said. "I was worried about you after our last conversation." As if he hadn't been the one delivering the very numbers that put me there in the first place. As if worry and cruelty could occupy the exact same sentence without either one of us noticing the contradiction sitting plainly between them. The room itself was all dark wood and leather designed carefully to project success and permanence, though what it actually projected now to my newly educated eye was something closer to desperate overreach dressed up in good lighting. A framed photograph of Kaylee and Adsila on some tropical beach hung above the mantel, taken I now understood likely on money that never should have belonged to them in the first place, and I found myself studying it a beat too long before catching myself and looking away. I sat where Keel gestured for me to sit, and I let the two of them pour me a drink I had no intention of finishing, and I let the small talk wash over me the way you let weather wash over you, without really letting any of it land. Dinner was salmon, and it was genuinely good. And I ate it slowly because eating slowly gave me somewhere useful to put my hands while I decided sentence by sentence exactly how much to say and exactly when to say it. Martin Keel began at one point, though he clearly meant Sahaley, and I let the slip pass without correcting him, watching to see whether either of them would catch it themselves, said you're ready to move forward on the transfer. I told him yes. I told him fighting Neshoba's wishes wasn't how I intended to spend whatever years I had left on this earth. Family harmony, I told them both, mattered more to me now than money ever could. I watched relief move visibly across both their faces at the exact same moment. Identical relief, the particular kind that only shows up on the faces of people who had genuinely believed, right up until that sentence, that there was still some real chance I might not fold after all. Bianca Keel said and caught himself correcting to Adsila's name with a small laugh meant to sound like an easy slip of the tongue, rather than the nervous stumble it actually was, and I filed that away too. One more small crack showing in a surface that had once seemed so smooth. "We've prepared some papers," Adsila added, reaching for a manila folder that had been sitting on the sideboard the entire meal, waiting there like a third guest none of us had properly acknowledged. Just to make everything official, our attorney drew them up to complement what Sahaley is already handling. Their attorney. Of course, they had brought in their own separate legal representation quietly without mentioning it to me until this exact convenient moment. I wondered, watching Adsila's careful smile, whether this mysterious new lawyer of theirs had any idea at all about Chaska's gambling debt, or about the particular pattern of complaints slowly accumulating against Kaylee's business 2 counties over. I asked mildly what firm they'd retained more out of curiosity about how far they intended to push things than any real interest in the answer. Keeley named some practice out of the capital I'd never heard of, said it a little too quickly the way people say things they've rehearsed saying casually. I nodded and let it go, filing the name away anyway the way I'd learned to file everything away those past few days, small and quiet for later. How thoughtful, I said, not reaching for the folder. But I should mention I've been doing some thinking about the medical bills. The temperature in that room dropped so fast I could have sworn I actually felt it against my skin. Chaska set his glass down harder than the moment strictly required. What kind of thinking, he asked, and his voice had lost its warmth, entirely gone flat and careful all at once. A lawyer's voice, the one he probably used on opposing counsel right before he cornered them. Well, I said $165,000 is a substantial amount of money. I was wondering whether perhaps an accountant should review the estate's liquid assets before I formally agree to carry that debt personally, given everything that's still technically tied up in probate. Keel shifted in his seat, his voice carefully neutral in that practiced way he had. That seems unnecessary, doesn't it? Everything's already been properly categorized. I mentioned the cabin next. Not the notebook, not the recorder, none of the rest of what I had actually found out there. Just a small detail dropped into the conversation like a single stone into perfectly still water, watching the ripples move visibly across both their faces at exactly the same moment. I said I'd found an old brass key I didn't recognize tucked away in Neshoba's desk. I said it was probably nothing, probably just more of his disorganized paperwork from some old lockbox somewhere, but that I intended to look into it properly before signing anything further. Keel's fork clattered hard against his plate. I watched the look pass between the two brothers, the same silent practiced communication I had caught once before in Neshoba's own office weeks earlier, except this time I understood exactly what it meant, having spent the days since learning precisely what that look was hiding. They were afraid, because whatever they thought they had successfully buried some part of both of them had never quite believed it would stay buried forever, no matter how carefully they'd covered the ground over it. Colleen Sidney, Chaska said, catching himself on a name that wasn't even mine, his composure slipping for just a fraction of a second before he corrected it. I hope you're not second-guessing our arrangement because of something someone else has told you. Sometimes people unfamiliar with estate law can offer misleading advice. Oh no, I assured him, keeping my voice perfectly pleasant. I'm not second-guessing anything at all. I'm simply trying to be thorough. Floyd, Neshoba always said the devil was in the details. Adsilla stood up too quickly and announced dessert with a brightness that fooled absolutely no one at that table, and I let her flee toward the kitchen, and I let Chaska walk me out to my car afterward, his hand resting on the doorframe in a way that was meant to look protective and only managed in the end to look exactly like control. About those documents, he said. Bring them to our next meeting. Let us help you sort through what actually matters and what doesn't. Of course, I told him. Family should help family. I watched him in my rearview mirror the entire way down that long driveway, phone already pressed to his ear before I had even reached the gate. He was not calling to check on his brother's evening. He was calling because something over the course of that dinner had frightened him badly enough that it plainly could not wait until morning. I drove home slowly that night, taking the long way around the reservoir rather than the direct route needing the extra 20 minutes to let my own pulse settle back to something ordinary. I turned the radio on and then off again within a minute, unable to concentrate on anything but the memory of Keel's fork clattering against his plate, the particular sound a person's composure makes when it finally cracks. I understood driving through the dark with the reservoir catching what little moonlight there was that I had just crossed some threshold I couldn't walk back across even if I wanted to. The performance of surrender was over. What came next would be something else entirely. Sahel called me himself 2 days later, and the moment I heard the particular strain in his voice, I understood immediately that something had gone wrong somewhere inside his own house, not mine. He asked to meet in person rather than over the phone. Not at the office. A quiet booth at the same diner on the edge of town where Ohansey had first laid those photographs out across the table between us. Saheli looked noticeably older than he had the week before, gray shadowed under his eyes, his hands not quite steady around a coffee cup he never once actually drank from. I need to tell you something, he said, and he could not quite bring himself to look at me while he said it. My assistant, Priscilla. She's been quietly passing details from your file to Chaska for months now. I didn't know. I want you to believe that I genuinely didn't know, but I should have seen it. I should have caught it far sooner than I did. I asked him once I'd had a moment to sit with it how he'd finally caught her. He told me it was almost nothing, a scheduling note in her handwriting he'd found on his own desk referencing a meeting with Chaska that had never appeared on any calendar. He kept himself a small enough detail that he might have missed it entirely if some instinct hadn't made him look twice. That's usually how it goes, he said more to himself than to me. The big betrayals almost never announce themselves. They leave one small thing out of place, and everything after that is just a person finally deciding to look. He told me he'd known Priscilla's family for years, had hired her as a favor to her mother, an old friend from before either of us had gray in our hair, and that the knowing had made him slower to suspect her than he should have been, the way familiarity always makes a person slower to see what's right in front of them. I understood that particular blindness better than I wanted to admit sitting across from him. I had spent 24 years failing to see plenty of things sitting right in front of me, too dressed up in familiar faces that made the seeing harder rather than easier. I sat with that admission for a long moment because it explained so much that had never quite made sense to me before now. The speed of their pressure. The uncanny way Chaska always seemed to know exactly which nerve to press before I had even finished thinking it through myself. Someone had been quietly feeding him a map of my own hesitations in something close to real time, and I had trusted the very office that map had originally come from without a single moment's doubt. I'm not asking you to forgive it yet, Saheli said. I'm only asking you to let me fix whatever of this I can still actually fix. I believed him. Not easily and not right away. But I believed him because the shame written across his face was not the shame of a man who had merely been caught doing something wrong. It was the shame of a man who had genuinely failed someone he cared about, and by then I had seen enough of both kinds of shame in my life to know the difference between them without needing to be told. He terminated her that same afternoon, he told me. He rebuilt my entire file himself alone in a locked cabinet, no copies floating anywhere, no assistant anywhere near it from that point forward. And he asked me quietly, almost hesitantly, whether I would let him stand beside me in whatever came next, not as the lawyer who had nearly cost me everything without ever meaning to, but as the one now actively trying to make it right. I said yes. I spent the days leading up to the confrontation, gathering everything into a single leather satchel that had once belonged to Neshoba himself, something he'd carried to cattle auctions for 20 years before it finally became mine to carry into a different kind of reckoning entirely. The notebook. The tape transferred carefully onto a small digital player Ahanu's office had provided in case the old cassette player finally gave out at exactly the wrong moment. Ohanzi's folder. The real will. The letter which I nearly left behind twice out of some superstitious fear of it getting damaged before finally deciding it belonged with everything else, the truest piece of all of it. Shanoa sat with me the night before, saying almost nothing, simply keeping me company at the kitchen table while I went through the satchel one final time, checking and rechecking that every piece was exactly where it needed to be. You don't have to destroy them completely to win this, she told me once quietly near midnight. But you also don't have to let them tell you what winning is supposed to look like either. That part is entirely yours to decide. The meeting was set for the following week, Ahanu's office chosen deliberately, this time around neutral ground, no history of leaks running through its walls. I drove out there alone that morning, the satchel on the seat beside me, and I made myself stop once along the way at the same turnoff near the old grain elevator, just to breathe for a minute with both hands still on the wheel. I thought about Neshoba's voice, the particular calm he always carried into hard conversations. The way he used to tell me that the person who needed the room to stay calm the most was usually the one who ended up controlling it by the end. I held on to that the rest of the drive. Chaska and Keel arrived together, and I noticed immediately that whatever composure Chaska had carried so easily in that driveway weeks earlier had entirely evaporated somewhere along the way. He looked walking through that door like a man who had spent several sleepless nights doing arithmetic. He badly did not want to be doing the kind of math that keeps circling back to the same unwanted answer, no matter how many times you rework it. Before I could speak a single word, he did. Before we go any further, he said, I want it formally noted that anything found among documents belonging to my father, taken without proper legal authority, constitutes theft of estate property. I'm fully prepared to file suit if it becomes necessary. The threat sat in the air between us, like smoke curling up off a fire nobody had actually lit yet. Kaylee looked genuinely startled by it, like even he hadn't expected his brother to open with something quite so sharp, so obviously rehearsed on the long drive over, which told me everything I needed to know before another word was spoken. Because a man who genuinely believes he is about to inherit $900,000 in prime riverland does not open a meeting by threatening litigation against a grieving widow. A man who suspects somewhere down underneath all that careful, practiced arrogance that the ground beneath him has already shifted does exactly that every single time. I set the satchel down on the table between us, unhurried, and let the small sound of its buckle undoing fill the silence for a moment, before I said anything at all. Some part of me had learned that much at least from 24 years of watching Neshoba close a business deal, that silence handled correctly could do more work than any number of words rushed out to fill it. I let the threat hang in the air a moment longer before I finally answered it. Everything I currently have, I said, my voice steadier than I had any real right to expect it to be. My husband left specifically for me to find. There is nothing here that was ever taken from anyone. There is only what he wanted me to eventually see exactly when he wanted me to see it, and not one moment sooner. The room itself felt smaller than I remembered from my first visit. Or perhaps it was only that 4 more people now filled it. Ahanu behind his desk, Chaska and Keeley seated stiffly across from us, myself, between them and the window, with this satchel resting heavy against my hip. Nobody offered anybody coffee this time. Nobody pretended even for a moment that this was a friendly visit. Ahanu opened the folder first, the real will, the clause already underlined in pencil, and slid it across the table without saying a single word. I watched Chaska read it. I watched his face move through disbelief, and then slowly something much closer to genuine fear as he finally reached the line, granting me full and sole discretion over what either of them would ultimately receive. Keeley leaned over to read it a second time after his brother pushed the page toward him, his lips moving faintly over the words, the same way a person reads something twice, hoping the second pass will somehow rearrange the meaning of the first. It didn't. I watched the exact moment it landed for him, a full beat after it landed for Chaska. his shoulders dropping the way a man's shoulders drop when he finally sets down something heavy he's been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. "This isn't possible," he said, and his voice had lost every last ounce of the coldness it had carried so easily in his father's office weeks earlier. "Dad would never have done this. Not to us. Your father did exactly this," Ahanu said quietly, 6 weeks before he died. "He came to me because he no longer trusted the office handling his previous will to keep his true intentions private from the people he needed kept in the dark." Then I opened the notebook myself. I read from it slowly, deliberately, watching every single entry land on Chaska's face like a small separate blow one after another. The name Denny Ashcroft. The date nearly a full year before his father's death, well before any diagnosis existed that could explain away the timing of it. I watched Keely's hands go completely still on the table when I finally read aloud the line about restructuring the estate before probate becomes a problem. Chaska tried to interrupt twice while I read both times with the same lawyerly reflex objecting to the admissibility of a private journal, as though we were standing in a courtroom rather than sitting in Ahanu's quiet office with nothing at stake but the truth. Ahanu let him finish both times patient as a man waiting out weather, and then simply nodded at me to continue exactly where I'd left off, which unsettled Chaska far more than any argument could have. A man used to controlling a room does not know what to do with a room that refuses to be controlled. Then I played the recording. The tinny voices filled that quiet office from end to end, and I watched Chaska's own words come back around to him from a small machine his father had hidden away in a cabin. Neither son had thought to check in years if either of them had ever known it existed at all. "She won't be a problem. She doesn't understand the accounts." His own recorded voice, flat and entirely certain, describing exactly how little he had ever actually thought of me in words he had never once expected to hear repeated back to him in this exact room. "I didn't know about the mortgages," Chaska said, suddenly quieter than anything he'd said, yet more to himself than to any of us. "I want that understood. Whatever else I didn't know he'd done that to the properties. It doesn't change what you did before he ever had reason to," I told him. "It only means he was already several steps ahead of whatever you were planning to do to me." Keel had gone completely white in the face by the time O'Hansy's folder finally came out onto the table. $275,000 in gambling debt laid out plainly in casino records and rolling credit lines. 3 separate elderly families with formal complaints filed against a consulting business that existed mostly on paper and very little else. I read Vera Talltree's name aloud once, deliberately watching something genuinely break behind Keel's eyes, as the specific number attached to it, just under $60,000, landed in a room full of people who now knew exactly what he had quietly built his comfortable life on top of. Chaska tried one final time. "This is harassment," he said, though the words came out thin, unconvinced, even by the man saying them out loud. "You cannot possibly prove intent from a handful of documents and an old cassette tape." Ahanu said, calm as ever, unbothered. "And more importantly, your own father had already done the proving for us long before any of us walked into this room. 11 months of it in his own hand, time-stamped and dated well before he ever received a single diagnosis. Either of you could try to blame this on." I slid the letter across the table last of all. Neshoba's handwriting unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen it, the line about mortgages taken out quietly against both properties, the deficit of $320,000 sitting patiently underneath everything they had both believed, right up until this exact moment. They had already won outright. I watched Chaska read that particular section twice through his mouth, moving faintly around numbers that refused to rearrange themselves into anything better, no matter how many times his eyes crossed back over the same lines. "You are not inheriting land." I told him, my voice steadier now than I had any real right to expect it to remain. "You are inheriting a hole your own father dug specifically deliberately, because he understood exactly what the two of you were capable of long before either of you ever gave him a real reason to say so out loud." Silence took over the room after that, a long one heavy enough to feel almost physical. Cale stared down at his own hands like he no longer fully recognized them as belonging to him. Chaska stared at the letter, and something in his jaw had gone slack in a way I had never once seen in 24 years of watching him carefully perform certainty for every other person in his life. Ahanu finally broke the silence himself, pouring 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on the side table and setting them in front of the brothers. Without comment, the small, practical gesture of a man who had sat in enough rooms like this one to know that people in shock sometimes need their hands to have something to do before they can speak again. Neither of them touched the glasses. But something in the offering seemed to loosen the room half a degree enough for Chaska to finally lift his eyes from the letter and look at me directly for the first time since I'd opened that satchel. "What do you want?" he finally asked, and for the first time since his own father's funeral, there was nothing rehearsed left anywhere in his voice at all. I looked at both of them for a long moment before I let myself answer. Because I had spent weeks by then deciding exactly what I wanted, turning it over and over the way I'd turned that brass key over in my palm the very first night I found it, and I had not decided in the end to destroy either of them completely, no matter how easily the evidence in that satchel would have let me do exactly that. "I want you to understand something first," I said. "Your father did not do any of this out of hatred for either of you. He did it because he loved this land and everyone still connected to it more than he ultimately trusted either of you to protect any of it. And because in the end, after everything, he trusted me, and only me to decide what happens next." Neither of them answered that. There was nothing left in the room for either of them to say in response, and for the first time since I had walked through that door with Neshoba's old satchel heavy against my shoulder, I understood clearly that the hardest part of all of this was no longer proving what they had actually done. Keeley lingered a moment longer than his brother before finally standing to leave his hand resting briefly on the back of his chair, as though he needed the support of it to find his feet. He didn't look at me directly. He said only quiet enough that I nearly missed it, that he was sorry in a voice that sounded for once like it actually belonged to the words coming out of it, rather than performing them for an audience. I didn't answer him. Some apologies need time to prove themselves before they're worth answering, and I wasn't yet ready to hand him that particular grace on the same afternoon I'd finally learned the full weight of what he'd done. I drove home from Ahanu's office that evening with the satchel empty on the seat beside me, every document already left behind in his locked cabinet, and I did not feel the triumph I had half expected to feel somewhere along the drive. What I felt instead was closer to exhaustion, the particular kind that settles into a person after carrying something heavy for exactly as long as it needed carrying and finally being allowed to set it down, even if only for a night. I sat in Neshoba's chair that whole evening without turning on a single light, letting the dark come up slowly around me, and I did not think about Chaska's face or Kaylee's white knuckles at all. I thought only about the key still sitting in the small dish on the desk where I now kept it, and about how strange it was that something so small had ended up carrying the exact weight of everything else. The hardest part still waiting somewhere, just ahead of me, was deciding exactly what I was willing to become in response to it. "What do you want?" Chaska had asked me in that office, and I had not answered him right away, because some answers need a few more days to finish forming properly before they are ready to be spoken aloud to another living person. I spent those days walking Ash Ridge alone, the way I had walked it 100 times before with Neshoba beside me, and would now for the rest of my life walk it without him. The pasture where the two of us used to walk after supper most evenings, his hand loose in mine, talking about nothing important at all, the kind of talk that only matters because of who you're saying it to. The workshop floor still dusted with leather scraps from a saddle he never got the chance to finish, the half-stitched seat still clamped in the vise exactly where he'd left it the last week he was well enough to stand at that bench. The porch of the lake lodge where sawdust had once clung stubbornly to his hair, while he told me nobody could ever take credit for what the two of us had built out there, but us alone. I walked all of it slowly, the way you walk through a house you are still quietly deciding whether or not to keep. Some mornings during that stretch, I found myself talking out loud to him as I walked the way you do with someone gone long enough that you've stopped feeling foolish about it and started simply treating it as a kind of prayer. I asked him more than once whether he'd known exactly how heavy this particular decision would sit on me when he built the whole trail leading here. I never got an answer, of course, only the sound of wind moving through the cottonwoods and my own boots in the frost. But the asking itself seemed to matter, seemed to be its own small form of the conversation. We no longer got to have any other way, because destroying them completely would have been so easy by then. I had enough sitting in that satchel to end both their lives as they currently understood them. Criminal charges, disbarment proceedings, headlines in a county small enough that everyone would recognize both names the moment they printed. Ohansey told me as much himself a few days after the confrontation, sitting across from me once more in that same diner booth, his voice careful and entirely without judgment either way. The evidence would hold up, he said. In court, in front of a licensing board, anywhere at all, I chose to bring it forward. I sat with that offer for a long time, turning it over the way I'd turned that brass key over in my palm on the very first night I found it. Until I understood somewhere around the 3rd or 4th day of walking that pasture alone that the version of myself capable of using every last piece of it fully was not a version of myself I actually wanted to become, no matter how thoroughly either of them had earned the reckoning. I thought about Vera Talltrees more than once during those days, a woman I had still never actually met sitting somewhere out past the county line with $60,000 of her own retirement quietly gone and no real path back to it on her own. Destroying Kaylee completely would not put a single dollar of that back into her hands. It would only give me the satisfaction of watching him fall. And satisfaction I was slowly coming to understand was a much smaller and much emptier thing than actual repair. Chenoa came out to Ash Ridge on the 4th day of that stretch, unannounced the way only an old friend can arrive without it feeling like an intrusion. She didn't ask what I'd decided. She only walked the pasture with me in silence for the better part of an hour, and near the end of it, she asked me a single question, the kind she'd always been good at asking exactly when I needed it. She asked whether I wanted to be the kind of woman this family would remember as merciful, or the kind they would remember as thorough. I told her I wasn't sure those two things were as opposed to each other as she made them sound. She smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen out of her in days, and told me that was probably the most honest answer I'd given anybody since the funeral. So I called Ahanu and asked him to draft something different entirely. We met one final time, all of us together in a room at Ahanu's office, with the afternoon light coming in low and gold through the western windows, the particular slanted light that only shows up in that county in the last weeks before winter fully sets in. Chaska arrived first alone, and something in the way he held himself, shoulders drawn in slightly, chin lower than it used to sit, told me he already understood there would be no clever negotiating his way around whatever came next. Kale arrived a few minutes later with Adsila beside him, her hand tucked into his arm in a way I hadn't once seen at that dinner weeks earlier, quieter now, far less performance woven through it than before. Ahanu had asked me once in the days before that meeting whether I wanted him to deliver the terms instead, to give me the shelter of a lawyer's flat, neutral voice standing between me and whatever reaction they had waiting. I told him no. I had spent 24 years letting other people's voices carry the weight of things that were mine to say, and I did not intend to hand this particular moment over to anyone else, however kindly it was offered. I laid out the terms myself. Not through Ahanu, though he sat close beside me the entire time with the paperwork ready. I wanted them to hear every word of it directly in my own voice, not filtered through a lawyer's careful phrasing. Chaska would step back from practicing law entirely, while a formal review of the falsified estate filings ran its full course, supervised, thoroughly documented, no quiet resignation letter, allowing him to simply slide sideways into some other firm 2 counties over and start fresh, with nobody the wiser. Alongside that, a real recovery program for the gambling, the kind with genuine accountability built directly into it, weekly meetings, verified attendance, no shortcuts and no quiet exceptions carved out for a man used to getting them. Kaylee would make full restitution to every single family named in Ohansi's folder, starting with Vera Talltrees. Not through some vague lawyerly apology delivered on cold letterhead months from now. Through actual structured repayment, garnished directly against his wages, for as long as it took, alongside real hours of community service performed through the same elder assistance office that had originally logged those families' complaints in the first place. And Ash Ridge, the lodge, the workshop, every last acre and board of it would remain entirely mine, exactly as Neshoba had always fully intended it to, with no theatrical division of anything between 2 brothers who had never once across the whole of that ledger I had spent so many long nights reading, treated the land as anything more meaningful than a number waiting to be liquidated. Chaska's jaw tightened visibly when I said that last part, but he didn't argue, because there was genuinely nothing left in him by then to argue, with no ground left underneath him solid enough to stand on and push back from. Kaylee just nodded, slow, his eyes wet in a way that looked, for what might have been the first time in years, almost entirely honest. Keel asked quietly whether the community service hours could be done somewhere other than the elder assistance office that had logged the original complaints. Some small flinch of pride still working its way loose, even in that moment. I told him no, that the whole point was standing in front of the exact harm he'd caused, rather than somewhere safely abstract from it. And he accepted that the way a man accepts a diagnosis, he already suspected with a kind of tired relief that the waiting at least was finally over. Adsila spoke up before either of them could say anything more. She said quietly, without any drama at all in her voice, that she wasn't leaving. Her hand stayed resting on Kale's arm the whole time she said it, and something in the plain, steady way she said it told me she meant to stay through all of the hard, unglamorous work still ahead of him, actually becoming a man worth having stayed for. I didn't know yet, sitting there, whether that particular commitment would hold over the months and years still to come. I only knew clearly that it was never my decision to make on her behalf, and I said as much to her directly, which seemed to steady something behind her eyes that had been shaking slightly since she first walked through the door. Before either of the brothers left that room, Chaska asked to speak with me alone for a moment, just the two of us out in the small hallway outside of Hanu's office. I expected another threat. What came instead was quieter, harder for him, I think, than anything he'd said in that entire confrontation weeks earlier. "I don't know how to be sorry the right way," he said, staring somewhere past my shoulder rather than at my face directly. "I don't think I've had much practice at it. But I understand now what I actually did. I understood it the moment you read that tape out loud in there. I just didn't know how to stop myself from becoming exactly that person while it was still happening, one small decision at a time. I didn't tell him it was all right. It wasn't all right, and I have never believed in telling people comforting lies simply because the truth felt too heavy to hand them in that particular moment. I told him only that understanding it now was worth something, even this late, even after everything, and that what he did with that understanding over the years still ahead of him would matter far more to me than anything he said standing in that hallway. He nodded once and did not try to hug me the way he had at Kaylee's house weeks earlier, and something about that restraint told me more than any apology could have. We signed the final papers 3 weeks later back in Hanu's office, the very same room, though the light had shifted noticeably with the season by then, thinner and colder against the glass winter finally arriving in earnest over Ash Ridge. I had written one line myself into the closing page of the settlement, something Hanu had gently tried to talk me out of including at all, worried it might read to a stranger as provocation dressed up in the language of simple courtesy. I kept it in anyway. Chaska's new attorney, a young man clearly not yet practiced at reading a room, correctly read the final page aloud out of pure habit, the way careful young lawyers do when they want a clean record of every clause being understood by every party present. He reached my line near the very bottom of the page. "I'm glad to have you here." It read, addressed to no one in particular, and to everyone in that room all at once. The words I had chosen deliberately weeks earlier because they were the only entirely true thing I had left to say to two men who had once called me mother only when it happened to serve them in the moment. I watched his face lose its color as he understood a full beat too late that the woman who had supposedly surrendered everything 3 months earlier in that very first meeting at Ash Ridge had in fact been the only person in either room who had ever actually held the pen that mattered. Chaska didn't smile when the meaning landed. Neither did Kale. But neither one of them argued either, and by the time the last signature finally dried on that page, it hadn't been quiet since the day I first found that small brass key sitting cold in my husband's desk drawer. I sold nothing. I kept the ranch, the lodge, the workshop, all of it, standing exactly where Neshoba had built it, board by board, one long summer at a time, decade after decade before that. But I gave one corner of Ash Ridge away entirely, the northern acreage running along the river, where the cottonwoods grew thickest and oldest, and I put Neshoba's name on that parcel before I put anything else on it at all. The Neshoba Blackbird Fund opened that spring a small converted building near the old fishing cabin, staffed at first by nobody but me and a folding table and a phone that rang far more often than I had ever expected it to. Its purpose was simple enough to explain in a single sentence. Helping people, mostly women, mostly older than 60, who had discovered too late that the people closest to them had spent years quietly counting down toward their vulnerability instead of protecting it the way family is supposed to. By the second year, I'd hired someone to help answer the phones, a retired school teacher named for nobody in particular, just a steady woman with good handwriting and a gentler patience than mine, for the callers who needed to tell their whole story from the beginning before they could get to the part that actually hurt. We added a small library of pamphlets nobody reads cover to cover, but everyone seems to need sitting on the table anyway, something to hold while they talk. I learned more about power of attorney abuse and account skimming in those 2 years than I ever expected to know, not from any law book, but from sitting across a folding table from person after person, willing to tell me exactly how it had happened to them. Some weeks that first spring, the phone at the fund rang only once or twice, quiet enough that I worried the whole effort might quietly fold before it ever really found its footing. Other weeks it didn't stop from the moment I unlocked the door until well past dark, women driving in from 3 counties over some of them, barely able to say the actual dollar amount out loud, the first time they sat down across the folding table from me, as though naming the number too plainly might make the loss more real than it already was. I learned quickly that the money mattered less in that first conversation than simply being believed without having to argue for it first. Vera Talltrees came to see me herself that first spring, a small woman with sharp eyes and a cane she clearly resented needing driven out by a neighbor because she had stopped trusting her own judgment about who to let get close to her finances after everything. She didn't want to talk about the money at first. She wanted to talk about her late husband, about the ranch they'd built together 40 years earlier, about how strange it felt to be this age and still discovering exactly how much a person could lose without ever once raising their voice about it. I understood every single word of what she meant. I sat with her for 2 hours that first afternoon, and by the time she finally left, some of the restitution money had already started moving quietly back into her account, and something in her face had eased in a way I recognized immediately because I had felt that same easing myself weeks earlier, sitting in Neshoba's chair with the truth finally spread out in front of me instead of hidden underneath it. A year to the week after that first dinner at Kaylee's house, Chaska drove out to Ash Ridge on his own without calling ahead, which was unlike him in every way I'd ever known. He stood in the driveway a while before he came to the door, the same driveway where I'd once watched him pace with a phone pressed hard to his ear. And when I finally let him in, he told me he'd completed a full year of the recovery program, verified no gaps, and that his sponsor had suggested he mark the anniversary by facing something he'd been avoiding rather than something he could simply check off a list. He didn't ask for anything that afternoon. He sat in the kitchen, drank a cup of coffee he barely touched, and told me about the meetings plainly without performance, the way a man talks when he's finally stopped trying to manage an audience. Before he left, he asked whether he could see the workshop, and I walked him out there myself, and we stood a long while in front of that half-stitched saddle, still clamped in the vise exactly where his father had left it. He didn't say much. Neither did I. Some visits don't need many words to matter. I drove out to the small chapel cemetery not long after the fund officially opened the first time I had gone back since the burial itself. I stood at his grave a long while, the frost just starting to lift off the grass at my feet, and I told him out loud the way I'd taken to talking to him on my walks that I had chosen mercy over ruin, that I hoped it was the choice he'd actually wanted, rather than simply the one he'd made possible. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along that fence line, the same way it moved through the ones out at Ash Ridge, and I let myself believe standing there that some part of him had heard me. There was a second woman who came to the fund that first summer I still think about often, an old ranch hand's widow from 2 counties over, who had lost nearly everything to a nephew she'd trusted with power of attorney. She didn't cry the way some of the others did. She sat very straight in the folding chair across from me and asked plainly whether I thought it was foolish to have trusted family in the first place. I told her it wasn't foolish at all. I told her trusting family is the whole point of having one, and that the failure when it comes belongs entirely to the person who broke that trust, and never once to the person who simply expected it to be honored the way it was supposed to be. Halona Stormcloud came to see me the week we officially opened a Hanu's daughter younger than I had somehow expected, with her father's same unhurried calm, sitting quietly behind her eyes. She ran a small advocacy office 2 counties over. She told me the kind of steady, unglamorous work most people never hear about until the exact moment they need it desperately and have nowhere else left to turn. She asked whether I would be willing to speak with some of the women who came through her doors, not as a lawyer, not as any kind of expert, just as someone who had lived through exactly what they were currently living through and had come out the other side of it still standing upright, still whole enough to be useful to somebody else walking the same road a few steps behind me. I said yes before she had even finished asking the full question. The workshop stayed open, busier than it had ever been in Neshoba's lifetime. If I'm honest, though, I suspect some of that traffic came from people curious to meet the widow who'd apparently outmaneuvered her own stepsons, rather than any real surge in demand for good saddle work. I didn't mind the curiosity. I took on my first apprentice that second year, a granddaughter of one of the ranch hands who'd worked the land for Neshoba, 17 years old and stubborn, in exactly the way I recognized from my own younger self, and I taught her to cut leather the same slow, blistering way Neshoba had once taught me, refusing to let her quit on a bad week, the same way he'd once refused to let me. Watching her hands finally stop shaking around a blade felt like its own kind of inheritance passed forward, one that had nothing to do with land or money at all. Sahale still handles what little legal work Ash Ridge requires these days. The workshop's contracts, the occasional boundary question, and something between us settled back into place slowly over that first year. Not quite what it had been before Priscilla, but honest in a different way than before tested and still standing. He told me once, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, he actually drank this time, that he thought Neshoba would have been proud of how I'd handled the whole of it, and I told him I didn't need Neshoba's pride to know I'd done right by myself, though I was grateful all the same to hear it said out loud by someone who'd known him nearly as long as I had. My apprentice asked me once, cutting leather at the bench beside mine on a slow Tuesday afternoon, whether I ever regretted not simply taking Chaska and Kaylee to court and being done with it, letting a judge decide instead of carrying the decision myself. I told her the truth that some nights I still wondered about that particular road not taken, whether it would have been cleaner faster, less costly to my own peace of mind in the short run. But I told her too that a courtroom only ever hands down a verdict, and what I'd wanted in the end was something closer to a reckoning that left room for either of them to actually change, which no judge could have ordered into existence, no matter how thoroughly the evidence was laid out. She nodded slowly at that, the way a 17-year-old nods at something she suspects she'll only fully understand in another 20 years, and went back to her stitching. I won't pretend the grief itself ever fully resolved the way people sometimes hope stories like this one resolve tied off clean at the end with nothing left loose. Some mornings I still reach across the bed before I'm fully awake, expecting to find him there, and the particular emptiness of that reaching hasn't gotten any easier in the time, since only more familiar, the way a scar becomes familiar without ever quite becoming invisible. I've made peace with that. I think he would have wanted me to, rather than pretending towards some tidier version of healing that never actually existed for anyone I've ever known who lost someone the way I lost him. The seasons keep turning over Ash Ridge the way they always have. Regardless of any of it, the cottonwood's gone gold and then bare and then green again each year without needing permission from anyone. I planted new roses along the garden fence the spring after the fund opened the same variety Neshoba and I had first put in the ground together decades earlier, and I like to think he'd approve of how stubbornly they've taken to that soil, the way certain things do when they're finally given room enough to grow the way they were always meant to. Chenoa turned 70. The autumn after the fund opened, and I threw her a small party out on the lodge porch. Nothing grand, just the women from the ranch families, and a cake I baked myself from a recipe neither of us could remember the origin of anymore. She cried a little that evening, unusual for her, and told me she'd spent most of her life being the steady one, the friend who showed up and held things together for everyone else, and that watching me finally become someone who held herself together without needing to be told how had been one of the great unexpected gifts of growing old. I told her she'd been holding me together for 40 years, and it was long past time I returned the favor even a little. We didn't say much else about it. Some friendships don't need many words to carry the weight they carry. Chenoa still comes by most Sundays, and we sit on the porch of the lodge the way we used to sit on porches as girls talking about nothing important at all. The kind of talk that only matters because of who you're saying it to. She was there the day the fund's first check went out to Vera Talltrees, standing quietly beside me on that same porch, watching a small piece of an old wrong finally start working its way back toward right. Keel calls sometimes now on Sunday evenings, mostly his voice careful and a little unsure of itself in a way it never used to be, telling me about the community service hours, about a meeting he'd attended that week, about small ordinary things that would have meant nothing to me once, and now mean quite a lot precisely because they cost him something real to say out loud to me. Adsila is still there beside him from what I understand. Whether that holds for the long years still ahead of them isn't mine to know or to guess at. I only know it isn't my place to hope for it or against it either way. Chaska writes on occasion, short careful letters rather than calls, the kind of letters a man writes when he is still learning slowly how to be honest on paper before he trusts himself to be honest out loud. I don't always know what to write back. Some days I don't write back at all, but I read every one of them twice through, and I keep them in the same small drawer where I once found that brass key, because it seems fitting somehow, that particular drawer holding both the wound and whatever small uncertain healing has managed to grow up slowly around the edges of it since. One of those letters. The most recent one told me he'd started mentoring at a legal aid clinic 2 nights a week, working with families trying to navigate probate on their own, without the money for a proper attorney. He wrote that he thought his father would find something fitting in that a man who'd once tried to game the system now spending his evenings helping people who could never afford to game anything. He didn't ask me what I thought of it. I think he's learning slowly that some things don't need my approval to be worth doing. I wrote back for the first time in months after that one, just a single line telling him I hoped he kept at it. It felt like enough for now, and I have learned that enough is its own kind of progress. Neshoba never told me exactly what it would cost me to use what he left behind. I don't think he could have known precisely not the particular shape grief and reckoning would end up taking once the two of them finally arrived together in the very same room. But he trusted me with it anyway, all of it, the full weight of the decision, resting entirely in my own 2 hands rather than his, And some evenings sitting alone in that chair with the last light sliding slow off the river outside the window, I understand more clearly than I understand almost anything else in this life that trust was the truest inheritance he ever actually left me. I keep the key itself in the same small dish on the desk where I first set it down after that final signing brass, gone slightly brighter now from all the handling since no longer hidden away in a drawer waiting to be discovered, but sitting out in plain sight, the way I've come to believe most true things eventually deserve to sit. Some visitors to the fund notice it there and ask about it, and I tell them the short version, a key that opened more than I expected it to. Most of the time, that's all the explanation anyone actually needs. Everything else, the land, the money, the reckoning itself, was only ever the shape it happened to come wrapped in.